A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
It started as a typical Thursday night, the kind of evening when my friends and I would seek refuge from the humdrum of work with a trivia night at our favorite local pub, the Rusty Anchor, its dim lighting and rickety wooden tables giving off a cozy yet slightly eerie vibe that always felt just off enough to keep you on your toes. We were a group of four: Jake, the obnoxious know-it-all, Marissa, who had a thing for random facts, Sam, our self-proclaimed trivia king, and me, just along for the ride, sipping on our drinks, tossing our heads back in laughter as we attempted to answer questions about obscure pop culture, animal facts, and bizarre historical events. As the night ambled on, we began to notice the questions getting increasingly strange. They started with the usual mix of geography and entertainment trivia, things like what's the capital of Iceland? Followed by the equally mundane who starred in the movie Fight Club? Before long, I'd noticed the trivia host, a wiry guy who introduced himself as Mikey, shift into something different, his grin widening just a fraction as he leaned into the microphone. Question 3, which creature is said to haunt the abandoned subway lines of New York City? A chuckle spread through the group, our banter had never involved cryptids before. Then came another question that made the air feel heavier: what's the dark web term for a human scavenger? At this point, Jake leaned in and whispered, has anyone else felt like maybe this is getting a little too weird? I shrugged it off, convincing him that it was just part of the evening's theme. But weird turned to sinister when the next round began, and Marissa gasped, her wide eyes betraying both excitement and concern, as Mikey leaned closer to the mic. Question 1, if you had to sacrifice one friend to survive an apocalypse, who would it be? Silence fell over the table, tension thick as we exchanged glances. No one laughed, but Jake snorted uneasily, as if breaking some unspoken pact to take things seriously. I half expected it to be a prank or a joke, but Mikey's expression remained eerily composed, the corners of his mouth twitching upwards as though he relished our discomfort. Then, he continued, listing off in a mockingly cheerful tone. Question 2, what's the name of the entity that feeds on regret and despair? A chill crept down my spine. This wasn't just trivia anymore. It was unsettling psychological torture wrapped in a guise of casual fun, a twist from which I couldn't escape. I could see Sam's face go pale. The way his fingers trembled around his beer glass was a subtle but clear indication that he felt the same pressure to play along. Somehow, I was still desperate to cling to the normalcy of the night, fighting back the urge to bolt from the pub. Look, I said, forcing a grin to mask my anxiety, no more apocalypse or regret questions, please. But Mikey simply winked and moved on, his next inquiry sending ripples through the crowd. True or false, the woods are alive. It felt almost like an incantation, the way the words hung in the air, stifling laughter and igniting a kind of primal fear that clawed at the back of my mind. People began to shift uneasily in their seats around the room, and I couldn't help but steal a glance at the window, where the black night felt alive, the shadows dancing in a way that made me question if we were still in our reality or had been sucked into a warped game beyond comprehension. We pressed forward regardless, but the questions morphed into something I couldn't wrap my head around. What hidden truths live in the walls of your house? And how many minutes do you have left before they come for you? It was as if they were pulling straight from the fibers of our deepest fears and projecting them into the open like a psychic's taunting guesswork, and I felt something inside me shrivel up with every passing minute. Just when the atmosphere seemed unbearable, Mikey casually tossed the most gut-wrenching question of the night. His voice carried an eerie echo that reverberated off the rusty walls. For 5 extra points, name the person who you would willingly let consume your heart. Marissa turned ash-white as she squeaked out a nervous laugh, but the laughter faded as we all turned to stare at one another. My throat felt tight as I fought against the wave of dread washing over me. Jake, looking terrified, struggled to play it cool, but I could see the beads of sweat on his forehead. Then, one by one, we abruptly realized that we were being watched, not just by Mikey, but by the other patrons too, their eyes glinting with something all too sinister, as if they were candidates in a grotesque reality show where surviving the night depended on the answers we provided, and my heart was beating so hard I thought it might leap from my chest. What's going on? Sam whispered to the group, his voice slightly cracked, betraying his fear. I scanned the room, every face around the tables suddenly felt wrong, each patron shared that same unnaturally wide grin as if we were the subjects of their twisted entertainment. Time slowed, Mikey licked his lips and leaned closer to us now, almost conspiratorial in his tone. Remember, the wrong answer will cost you much more than just pride. With that, the dim light flickered overhead, sending shadows dancing devilishly across the walls, and all at once my vision became saturated with a sense of grave danger. "We need to get out of here," I blurted out, but before I could even stand, the door slammed shut with a clamor that seemed to resonate with the very pulse of the place. People began to stand, leaning towards us in an unsettling formation, and in that suffocating instant, I understood that we were prey in the presence of some dark hunters. I grabbed Marissa's arm as we made a mad dash for what felt like a grotesque exit through the clutches of unseen forces, desperate to escape the clutches of the sinister reality we'd stumbled into. Heart racing as the wild laughter echoed behind us, their questions continued to chase us into the night. The air thick with foreboding as I heard a low whisper behind me, chilling me to the bone, a phrase that echoed with a promise I knew all too well: "We still have so many questions left to ask." It started innocently enough. Each night, my husband would come home later than usual, shirt torn, cheeks bruised, and with a haunted look in his eyes as if he'd faced monsters I couldn't see. At first, I thought it was just an affair of the heart, a twisted romance with a stranger that left him battered and broken. But as the days turned into weeks, his physical state deteriorated, his hands becoming calloused and his temper flaring over the slightest provocation. I tried confronting him, pushing for answers, but each time he would deflect my questions with vague assurances that he was okay, that it was just work stress. The more I let it go, the more I sensed the dread pooling in my gut. I knew I needed to find the truth. So one Thursday night, I decided to follow him after he'd left for his usual late work meeting. I waited until he grabbed his coat, my heart thundering as I slipped on my shoes and followed stealthily behind him, ducking under street lamps and shadows as if the night itself were my ally. He drove through the maze of our suburban neighborhood, my anxiety bubbling with every turn, but he ultimately parked outside an old warehouse where the flickering light cast eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. I watched as he got out of the car, hesitating for a moment before marching inside, the heavy door creaking ominously. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, a taut string ready to snap, but I couldn't turn back now. I pressed forward, hiding behind a nearby dumpster, hoping I wouldn't be discovered. It wasn't long before the sounds of chaos erupted from within the building: shouting, grunts of exertion, the sickening thud of bodies colliding. I couldn't comprehend what was happening, but my curiosity and concern pushed me forward. Peering through a filthy window, I caught sight of my husband standing in a dimly lit ring, surrounded by a crowd of people raucously cheering, their faces illuminated by the brutal light of bare bulbs. My heart sank as I realized the truth. My husband, the man I once thought was gentle and kind, was a fighter, only this wasn't an organized sport, this was underground fighting, and the stakes were savage. I could see him take a punch to the face, blood gushing forth like a gruesome fountain, and still, he smiled, a wild, manic grin as he retaliated, hitting his opponent mercilessly. The crowd roared louder, spurring him on as I felt bile rise in my throat. He was addicted to this violence, thriving in a world where pain equated to power. I backed away, trembling, trying to process this revelation when one of the men playing referee came out, his hands raised in triumph after calling the match. "You made an easy $50 tonight, buddy." He jeered at my husband, who wiped the blood from his face, laughing alongside the crowd. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a pile of garbage, my mind racing. Was this the reason our once comfortable life felt like it was slipping through my fingers? Why he came home at odd hours, wearing a mask of brutality that didn't belong to him? Feeling trapped, I turned to leave. I had to get away before anyone noticed me, before I found out just how deep this rabbit hole went, when suddenly, a voice broke through the noise. "What do we have here?" A man with a crooked smile and eyes like daggers turned toward me, stepping closer, the crowd parting for him as if he were a king in his domain. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run. He had an intensity about him that demanded attention, a shiver down my spine telling me he was dangerous. My instincts kicked in as I made a desperate dash towards my car, but he was quicker, and just as I reached my vehicle, he caught me, his grip like iron around my wrist. "I would think twice before spreading whispers about what happens here, sweetheart," he said with a voice as smooth as glass yet laced with venom. "You wouldn't want your husband to lose everything, would you?" Fear flooded my senses as I tried to pry away, but his hold tightened. For a fleeting moment, I considered telling my husband everything, confronting him, but the reality of what I'd seen gripped me. He was in too deep, and so was I. I pulled myself free at the last moment and dove into my car, locking the doors just as the crowd started to murmur at the disturbance. I sped away, Heart racing, my thoughts churning with a grim understanding that my husband was not only fighting for money but also to escape some kind of monstrous debt that had spiraled out of control, a contract that chained him to this brutality. The next few days were living hell. I could barely focus on work, insomnia gnawed at me in the dark, and in the relief of silence, I felt his presence beside me, his every offhanded comment feeling like layers of a facade slipping away. I was convinced I'd confront him, but every time he came home, I noticed more bruises, deeper cuts, and the cycles of anger surfacing whenever I mentioned the stress in his eyes. As weeks turned to months, he grew darker, more volatile, and my gut instinct screamed to get out before we both fell victim to whatever had begun as just a fight he was losing. But before I could leave, a notification popped up on my phone, an invitation to one of the fights, where I was cordially invited to watch my husband lose, or worse, die. The name of the event sent a chill through me. The Last Stand. Every ounce of dread compelled me to attend, like a moth drawn to a flame. I slipped into the back once again, this time with a clearer head, taking in the air thick with sweat and desperation, each punch thrown echoing like a death knell. I felt sick but knew I had to make my presence known, step into the light as stripped away all pretenses. I waited until my husband was in the ring, his eyes aflame with adrenaline, a man transformed into a beast. I called his name, a wild, fraught note echoing in the chaos, and for a split moment, I saw the glimmer of recognition before I plunged into the crowd, a chasm opening before me as they cheered his demise. The man from before appeared beside me, laughter rumbling like distant thunder. "You really think you can save him? He chose this, sweetheart, and it's already too late." I screamed as he fell, every ounce of my being ripping apart as I pulled at the arms of the crowd, fighting to reach him, but it kept pushing me back. My husband was no longer the loving man I had married, the blood painting this arena was a testament to that. As he breathed his last in that ring, my screams drowned out by their cheers, I felt every hope, every dream, crumble to ashes, stinging my skin like the marks of a fighter not ready to leave the cage. I ran from the arena, tears streaming. Behind me, the shouts faded into the night, but yet I could feel the eyes of my husband, condemned to this underworld of fury and violence, watching from the shadows forever. My life transformed into a void where love was replaced by a horrifying memory, the legacy of a man who was coming home every night like he'd been in a fight he could never win. Now, all I can do is wonder if there's anywhere safe in a world where the demons of our choices bleed through. I always thought the stigma around 911 calls was a bit overblown. After all, who would dare to listen to an emergency call for fun? But when an IT guy I know, let's call him Dave, told me about a leaked transcript from a classified 911 recording he stumbled upon while running a routine audit, my interest peaked. According to Dave, this call was different, bizarre and chilling. It had been flagged for potential criminal involvement and subsequently sealed. He played it back for me over some beers at my apartment, and I wasn't ready for what I heard. The recording begins stark and silent, an operator's calm voice cutting through the tension. 911, what's your emergency? There's a pause, a scratchy inhalation, and then a girl's voice, thin and tremulous, answering, I don't know what to do. I think I see someone. The operator prods her for more information, but she's trembling with fear, her words spilling out in hurried, desperate gasps. He's outside, in the trees. I think he's watching me. The operator remains calm, asking her to describe what she sees, and through the haze of static, I hear the girl's breaths hitch as she tries to articulate her terror. He has this big hat, and his face. I can't see it. It's too dark. Then, in a chilling whisper, she mentions something that makes my spine tingle. He's smiling. When the operator asks her for her location, she hesitates, her voice quivering. I'm at the old library. I should have never gone there. That part struck me. The library was rumored to be haunted, a place where college kids dared each other to go at midnight, never to return the same. The operator's questions become more urgent as seconds drag into long, harrowing minutes. Can you lock the doors? He asks, but she replies, there's no point. I can feel him. The girl's breathing quickens, transformed from fear into a frantic panic as she begins pleading for help, her words barely coherent now, crying out into the abyss of static. Suddenly, an unsettling noise, like a subwoofer vibrating against silence, thrums through the call. What's happening? The operator demands. He's moving closer, her voice strained with terror. The trees, he's coming out of them. The thought twisted something in my stomach. She sounded as if she were recounting a nightmare, something slipping between the cracks of reality and the dark. At what felt like the peak of her dread, I heard rustling, and the girl's voice dropped to a whisper, "He's too close, I can see his teeth." Out of nowhere, she screams, an electric pitch filled with dread, "Get away from me." And the call cuts, leaving only heavy silence. The abrupt end, after what seemed like pure chaos, sent chills down my arms. "What happened to her?" I asked, half expecting him to shrug and give some mundane answer. Instead, Dave's face turned a shade paler as he looked away. He explained that the call had been traced, but what they found at that old library was not a girl in need of help. They discovered her phone, crushed beneath the creaking timbers of the library's collapse, and while the search team scoured the rubble, they didn't find a body, they found something else entirely. Dave hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, so I pressed him to continue. They reported seeing a shape, cloaked in darkness, lurking just beyond the reach of the searchlights, something that shouldn't have been there, a figure with an enormous hat and a split smile that never reached its eyes. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand on edge as he spoke. They say that her laughter echoed throughout the woods. That it repeated over and over, but she was never found. Just that sound of laughter, fading into the wind. No one ever talked about it again. The air turned thick with dread. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching us, lurking beneath the very stillness of our conversation. That day changed everything. After hearing the recording, I began to obsess over it. I spent sleepless nights combing through archives, hoping to find some clarification. What disturbed me further was the creeping sense that the story was being buried. Comments on the missing girl disappeared, threads whispered about her demise were being scrubbed. The authorities simply stopped mentioning it, and as winter rolled in, whispers of a figure haunting the woods surfaced again, but this time, it was more menacing. I learned from a bold poster on a local forum that after the discovery, people began disappearing, one by one. Their names forgotten until those intimate with their lives noticed they never showed up for work or class. By late November, 3 students had vanished, all last seen near that library. I went out there myself one night, just to see if something would happen. It felt wrong, but I was drawn to it like a moth to flame. When I arrived, the darkness seemed deeper than I anticipated, swallowing the weak beams of my flashlight, and for a moment, I felt foolish and small under the monstrous trees that lined the path. I stepped lightly, listening for anything out of the ordinary, trying to catch the shadows in my peripheral vision. Suddenly, laughter echoed through the night, soft yet haunting, and a wave of icy dread washed over me. Not like a child's giggle, but a taunting murmur that seemed to wrap around me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I spun around, adrenaline surging through my veins, but I was alone. Then, my phone buzzed, a notification that brought me crashing back to the moment. It was a news alert: student missing near old library, public advised to stay away. I stumbled backward, heart racing, squinting into the night for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, a figure, just beyond the trees, tall and thin, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its head tilted unnaturally, grinning. I snapped a picture, instinctively thinking I had to document this, but the image turned out blurry, as if something were interfering with my camera. Just then, a chill wind blew, and the laughter echoed again, now mocking, as I could feel the sweat pooling in my palms and forehead. I fled. Back in my apartment, I replayed the recording over and over, longing to find answers, a desperate need to understand the unexplainable. Each time, I felt her fear and desperation until something shifted inside me. It was as though the atmosphere surrounding that library had seeped into my dreams. I could see it every time I closed my eyes. The girl's echoing laughter morphed into a haunting melody, and that split smile unveiled itself in my darkest moments, creeping deeper into my thoughts. Days morphed into weeks, each one heavy with dread, and soon, I realized I was becoming increasingly paranoid. Strange noises near my window at night turned into whispers of laughter, resonating in the shadows. The thought of the girl's final moments swirled incessantly in my mind, as if something was beckoning me closer. Then, one night, the madness culminated as I received another notification, this one concluding the search for 2 more students. That sickening feeling rippled through my gut as I combed the comments, a sense of urgency crawling up my spine. After little digging, I found a user lurking who posted a cryptic message containing a single line that sent shivers down my spine: "It's smiling at me." In that moment, I realized, with growing horror, that maybe I wasn't the only one being haunted by this twisted tale. That night, I heard a knock at my door, gentle but insistent, and when I opened it, there was no one there. The absence of anything felt like a weight against my chest as I stared into the darkened hallway. Something, or someone, was waiting for me just out of sight. I thought back to that 1984-style leak, then my phone vibrated again. My heart raced as I opened the message, but it was just a photo. I clicked and felt cold wash over me. It was a blurry image of my own front door, taken from outside, the figure, faint but unmistakable, standing in my shadow. My breath caught in my throat, the culmination of everything I had researched crashing down on me. I slammed and locked the door, but the laughter was right there behind me, creeping through the walls like ink in water, and as I pressed my back against the door, I heard it pierce the stillness of my apartment, almost tenderly. "Will you play a new game with me?" I don't remember how I made it out of that night. Maybe I fell into an exhausted slumber, or perhaps I blacked out in fear. But I woke up to dawn breaking through my windows, and everything felt eerily calm, as if I were simply being lulled into a false sense of security. Yet, deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I braced myself for whatever would come next, and as I stared into the brightening sky, that haunting laughter echoed one last time in my mind, "You're next." An unsettling truth crept into my life after my grandfather passed. While grappling with grief, I suddenly realized that nothing I ate tasted right. It began with the coffee I needed to get through mornings, the rich aroma I'd always loved morphing into a flavorless sludge that left me gagging. Things only worsened from there. Cereal became cardboard, my beloved spaghetti tasted like wet tissue, and even the comfort of chocolate felt like chewing on crumbs of dust. My friends laughed it off, insisting that it was simply my melancholic state bleeding into my palate, yet I knew something was wrong. A gnawing dread coiled in my gut. Could this be a form of depression? But no, it was deeper, a heavy fog of something sinister wrapping around me, drenching everything in a dull monotone. I began avoiding meals altogether, choosing instead to endlessly scroll past mouth-watering recipes and drool-worthy food photos on my phone, watching as the vibrant colors blurred into the background of my existence. One night, in an effort to break the cycle, I visited an old diner on the outskirts of town after hearing whispers about their legendary pancakes. The diner glowed warmly under the night sky, and I felt hope as I walked through the door, but as I bit into the fluffy golden stack, the taste was nothing. It was a void, an absence that pinched my spirit. Defeated, I fled into the darkened streets and found myself drawn to a nearby grocery store lit like a beacon through the haze of my despair. I wandered the aisles aimlessly, staring blankly at rows of perfectly packaged foods, each label a mockery of flavors I could no longer experience. That's when I met her, a woman with raven black hair and piercing eyes who seemed to draw the air away from the room. "You look lost," she said, her voice a soft melody against the silence around us. I half laughed, half sobbed as I confessed my plight, hoping she would understand. She leaned closer, a flicker of excitement igniting in her gaze. "I can help you," she whispered, "but you have to trust me." It felt absurd yet magnetic, the idea that a stranger could offer me a way back to tasting life. She led me down a narrow aisle lined with dusty jars and forgotten ingredients, her fingers brushing past grotesque labels that warned of forbidden flavors. "This is the answer to your problem," she said, holding up a jar filled with what appeared to be blackened, swirling liquid. "Embrace the dark. It will open your senses." My instincts screamed at me to run, but desperation pulled me closer. I took the jar, heart racing with a mix of fear and hope, and brought it home, unsure of what it contained. That night, with trembling hands, I cracked it open and a rancid scent wrapped around me like a shroud. Against the warning bells ringing in my mind, I dipped a spoon into the thick liquid and brought it to my lips. The flavor that erupted in my mouth was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was raw and chaotic, fragility, twisting into ecstasy. For the first time, food had a punch. Wine didn't taste like grapes anymore, it dripped like honey, sharp and rich, while the bread felt alive, pulsating with warmth. With that first taste, my body surged with a high I hadn't expected, vivid sensations flooding my senses, memories exploding in flashes. But then, a gnawing fear clawed at me, the realization that I had invited something sinister into my life. I had opened a door I could never truly close, and each meal thereafter was a concoction I had to tweak, increasing the dose to chase that first euphoria. Days turned to weeks, and soon those tasty moments twisted dark, becoming an unquenchable thirst, an addiction that eclipsed my life. I turned insatiable, devouring strangers' meals at restaurants, stealing bites of their food without remorse, all to avoid that dreadful taste of emptiness returning. The woman visited me sometimes in dreams, her shadow eclipsing my thoughts, urging me to indulge deeper, to lose myself completely. More, she whispered, a siren's call echoing our past, entangling my desires and echoing in the recesses of my mind. Each time I indulged, the hue of sweetness became darker, the emptiness creeping back like a tide at my ankles until I found myself at the brink of drowning. I woke one night to a strange groaning sound under my bed. The darkness had manifested into a massive, twisted entity, its limbs laden with sorrow and hunger. It whispered to me, promising more if only I'd continue feeding it the wrong flavors. Panic seized me. I was feeding some unfathomable beast that would never be satisfied, and I realized too late that nothing I had consumed had truly belonged to me. The black liquid rendered me a stranger within my own skin, transforming my cravings into a void. I ran to the grocery store, but the woman's presence felt distant, a ghastly memory haunting each aisle. I screamed for understanding, for salvation, until the old diner loomed ahead like a faded photograph of better times. There, I stood with my heart gripped in a shadow's hand, begging for help, but all that stared back at me were the cold plates and empty chairs. I opened that cursed jar one last time and realized, too late, that nothing I ate would ever taste right again, each bite crawling with shadows, laughter piercing in the dark, echoing a truth that twisted in the recesses of my mind. No matter how hard I tried to escape the prison of flavorless memories, I was devouring nothing but the ghosts of my own despair. My brother should never have agreed to be ethically altered. It didn't even sound real when he first mentioned it over dinner, his excitement threading through the air like a child who had just discovered a world of magic he thought was relegated to fiction. After all, who wouldn't want to live in the age of bioenhancements, where you could trade in a pathetic memory for a perfect one, reduce anxiety with a mere injection, or elevate your intelligence with a simple procedure? At the time, I thought he was just swept up in the latest craze. Everyone was raving about it, from social media influencers to celebrities, endorsing the changes with a fervor that made disbelief seem obsolete. Our parents were skeptical, too busy worrying about the ethics of it all. Dad was especially fixated on the phrase ethically altered, as if it were a phrase that might as well have been coined from a dystopian novel. My brother, however, was undeterred. It was only after a series of hushed conversations with some friends that he finally decided to go for it, wearing that cocky grin that said he was about to unlock some hidden potential that the rest of us could only dream of. I tried to talk sense into him, but my words evaporated like mist in the sun. He was an adult now, at least in legal terms, and there was no stopping him. A week later, at the crack of dawn, he strutted out the door to the clinic, leaving a storm of apprehension behind. The first sign that something was off came a day after the procedure. Instead of the anticipated burst of brilliance, he seemed different, fragmented, like a puzzle that had lost its key pieces. There was a peculiar vacancy in his eyes, as if someone had pushed pause on the essence of who he used to be. I brushed it off, thinking that he was just adjusting, that maybe the enhancements took time to settle in, but deep down, an unsettling thrumming of dread was forming a permanent thrum in my gut. The days morphed into nights, and I began to notice strange things, the way he'd laugh too easily at jokes that weren't even funny, or how his once passionate political arguments had twisted into a dull acceptance of everything he used to hate. He even started obsessing over the most trivial things, like reorganizing the attic based on the color of childhood toys. I mean, who cares? I caught him staring at the wall with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was the way some people look at a rich dessert or a fine work of art, an unholy fascination instead of the brotherly familiarity I craved. When he started talking about his improved perception of reality, that's when I knew I had to intervene. He claimed to see things differently, brighter, more vivid. The world became a kaleidoscope, a masterpiece of sensations. It sounded beautiful, until he began to mention the shadows that trailed him, dark, writhing bits of energy that flickered just out of sight, shadows that whispered secrets of people he hardly knew, tales of anguish and pain stitched into the fabric of their existence. At first, he attributed it to what they called increased awareness, but the fear creeping into his voice grew palpable, inching closer to paranoia. "They don't want me to know," he said, voice trembling. "They don't want anyone to know what's lurking in their hearts." I thought it was a side effect, surely a call to the clinic would clarify that. It was late, but he was engrossed in some metaphysical rant about consciousness, and I couldn't shake the gut feeling that I needed to do it for him. I dialed the clinic, And after a series of transfers and hushed voices, a clipped response confirmed everything I feared: there were known complications. Ethical alterations have a history of triggering psychological phenomena, the voice told me before fading into a sterile echo. We recommend caution. As I hung up, a simmering fear ignited inside me. What would happen if my brother couldn't distinguish reality from the feelings these shadows invoked? I watched as he slipped deeper into himself, caught between a vibrant high and a chilling darkness that bubbled just beneath the surface. The laughter morphed into manic bursts, rattling the windows, and his smiles felt frozen, like a mask that threatened to crack under pressure. When he confronted the shadows over dinner one night, loudly declaring he could see my fears and secrets lay bare before him, I was terrified, because it became clear to me he was no longer my brother. He was an entity, something transformed into something else entirely, and they were whispering to him. I turned to him and pleaded with desperation, seeking for the last strands of the person I knew, but he just smiled that hollow smile, eyes unfocused yet fixated, and said, "I can hear them, can't you?" I prayed he couldn't, but even as I denied it, shadows danced in the corners of my vision, clawing at the edges of my sanity. My brother's transformation accelerated. He would mumble fragments of thoughts, new theories about connections, and cosmic energies that I couldn't follow. He was unraveling, consumed by the allure of the altered mind. It wasn't until I found him standing in our backyard one evening, staring into the woods as if they were a portal, that I knew something had to be done. I couldn't let whatever was inside him take full reign. I grabbed his arm, shaking him like a person waking from a nightmare, fear lacing my voice as I urged him back inside. But he stood rooted, his face betraying a dangerous calm. "You don't understand," he said, "they've chosen me. I've been gifted." In that moment, the realization pierced through me like a shard of ice. He was convinced he was special, a chosen representative between human experience and the shadows that plagued our realms. My last resort crept out from memory, a forbidden conversation I had overheard about a clinic in the city that performed reversals of the ethically altered. Doubting my own abilities, I decided to try. Perhaps it was desperate hope or plain foolishness. I seized his hand and pulled him with me, my heart hammering, but he fought against my resistance, shrieking words that only half made sense to me. He called out names from our childhood, wrongs I had long forgotten, and every syllable struck me like a whip, bringing forth those agonizing threads of our shared past. I could see anger and sadness painting shadows across his face instead of the darkness that had corrupted him. I buckled, my resolve wavering, but all that flickered within him held the echo of my brother, my true brother. "Please, let me help you," I screamed, voice cracking, but as he opened his mouth to respond, the shadows behind him coalesced into something ephemeral that gripped my throat with icy fear. I might have gasped, backing away, but the spectral whispers of his gift wound around us, luring me into the abyss. In that instant, I had a vivid choice: either embrace the horror and lose my brother entirely, or drag him back into the light, even if it meant facing whatever demons lingered in the dark. With a final act of desperation, I lunged at him, and as our bodies collided, the shadows writhed and screamed into silence, a deafening void swallowing the chaos as if the universe held its breath. The clinic was a stark expanse of fluorescent lights and sterile sensations, a jarring reminder of what we desperately sought to reclaim. I held his hand tight while we waited, his eyes flickering like candle flames dancing against the draft of an unseen wind. Each second felt like an eternity as the voices morphed into distant echoes, longing to reclaim him. Each time the door swung open, revealing another altered soul emerging into a world of uncertainty, my heart tightened because, with each passing moment, I realized the brother I knew was slipping further away. After what felt like hours, we were called in, and the doctor, despite his clinical demeanor, saw the abyss in my brother's eyes. "The changes you've experienced," he began, but my brother interrupted, voice choking with fury and fear, insisting he could not be cured, that he was liberated from the chains of ignorance. "You've given up your agency," I cried, desperate tears pooling. "Fight against these shadows." But my brother remained still, a brittle figure trapped in a whirlwind of thoughts that whisked him into oblivion. As the doctor prepared for the procedure, I clung to an idea, a last gasp that would anchor him to me. "Remember when we were kids?" I whispered urgently, summoning memories of laughter and warmth, of all those times we had fought and made up. We rode our bikes down the hill, and you kept falling but never gave up. I saw the flicker of something stir within him, a crack in the cold armor the shadows had forged. "You won that stupid race," I urged. "You were always the brave one, the smartest one, and I looked up to you. Don't let them take that from you." As the doctor proceeded, the shadows hissed louder, weaving through the sterile room like a tempest. For each embrace from the needle, I clung to my words, pouring my memories into the void that was my brother's mind. With each heartbeat, I witnessed a miraculous struggle, the flickering shadows contending against the blooming light of recollection, and finally, as the procedure concluded, my brother's body became a battlefield of anguish and triumph. When those familiar eyes finally sharpened and looked back at me, the ghosts were still swirling in the periphery, but there nestled within was a twinkle of recognition. My brother was still there. As he emerged from the fog, collapsing against me in relief, I could still hear the whispers echoing faintly, the remnants of what he had experienced clinging like dust to a sunbeam. I understood then that we would have to fight together, that his path back to himself would be fraught with shadows, but I would shield him with every ounce of love I had in me. We walked out of that clinic into a world no longer blurred by dark lore but still fraught with danger, shadows lingering ever distant yet a reminder of the fragility of the human spirit when tempted by the promise of power. I realized we were forever changed by his choice. My brother had stepped dangerously close to the edge of the abyss, but this time, together, we would find our way back into the light. It started with a casual conversation on a Tuesday evening, light-hearted, filled with the laughter of college kids winding down from a long day, but when my girlfriend, Claire, told me I wasn't her type, something inside me cracked. She never elaborated, just shrugged as if it were an afterthought, leaving me to face the lurking shadows of self-doubt that crept in with the fading sunlight. At first, I tried to shake it off, punishing myself for the weakness of my ego. After all, Claire was perfect on every level, smart, beautiful, effortlessly social, and I was just a hapless guy whose biggest achievement was sinking hours into video games. Yet, the words echoed like a haunting refrain, reverberating through my skull, gnawing at my heart until I couldn't sleep, picturing her with all those other guys who fit into the mold she had neatly crafted, guys who wore the trendy clothes, had the perfect haircuts, and could actually say they enjoyed working out instead of marathoning sci-fi series. Days turned into a blur of me analyzing every interaction, every smile she threw my way. Was it pity? Was it boredom? What was so wrong with me that I couldn't be her type? The anxiety morphed into obsession. I found myself following her on social media, scrutinizing her interactions with this muscular guy from her chemistry class whose posts were flooded with gym selfies. Sometimes I'd see her liking his pictures and my stomach would twist into a tight knot, and I convinced myself this was the beginning of the end. I'd lie awake at night, heart racing, imagining her slipping away, noticing how the way she looked at me shifted ever so slightly, like she was watching me drown without a hint of a life preserver in sight, and gradually, I lost my sense of worth, morphing into this shell of a person who was terrified of offending her or revealing my weaknesses. One night, after noticing she had posted another selfie with the dude from class, I confronted her, my voice quivering, raw with desperation, and her expression twisted into annoyance. "It's just a picture, you know that, right?" she snapped, and when I pressed her for more clarity on her type, she rolled her eyes. "Can't you just focus on being you?" But in that moment, I felt like me just wasn't enough anymore. Days turned into weeks, and I began to seep into a dark hole of anxiety and insomnia, odd thoughts forming with morbid clarity. I couldn't shake the idea that if I couldn't truly be who she wanted, I'd have to embody the type she described. I'm no stranger to the online world, so with frantic energy, I dove deep into the rabbit hole, devouring fitness and fashion videos, piecing together the public persona I could create, an inescapable facade of masculinity that would weave me into her world seamlessly. I joined a gym, thoughtlessly disregarding the sweltering sweat and exhaustion coursing through me, and every time I stepped into that fluorescent-lit hellhole, I felt monstrous and alive, pushing myself for every ounce of strength, running on raw determination mixed with sheer terror. As my body transformed, it felt like someone paid attention to the figure looking back in the mirror, but every praise I wallowed in at the gym still couldn't quell the gnawing inside, that clawing fear that I could never truly become what Claire needed, and it consumed me further until I became obsessed with the will to possess what I thought I lacked. But I was losing my own identity in the process. Friends began to comment on how different I was, while visions of my former self slipped through my fingers like sand, yet I cradled Claire's praise like a warm blanket and willed myself to believe she would finally see me as her type. The nights I would lay awake finally turned in, awakening next to an almost stranger in my own bed, this muscular facade who thought he could win her heart through sheer visuals. The screaming implications disguised as compliments for my newly chiseled body echoed hollow in my mind. Then one fateful night, after a long week of training, an invitation came for an end-of-semester party thrown by her friends, and for a fleeting moment, I felt sure this would finally confirm everything. I would revel in the new attention and win Claire's heart back wholly. But as the party buzzed with life, I felt a chill creeping up my spine every time I glimpsed Claire across the room, laughing effortlessly as she leaned over to talk to that hulk of a guy, his arm slung casually over her shoulder as if she belonged to him. I fought the suffocating wave of envy rising in my throat as I approached, but the sudden laughter died in my chest when I overheard her say, "You know, sometimes I think we'd be like the perfect couple." Then it crashed down upon me like a tidal wave of realization. No matter how I reinvented myself physically, the intangible connection we shared, the sparks of spontaneous laughter, our late-night talks, was now a frayed thread, slipping away. I staggered backward, aware that it wasn't merely about a rejection. She hadn't just called me out, she had unknowingly stripped away my identity piece by piece. I turned to leave, heart pounding in my ears, when I caught myself in a mirror. No, not just the mirror, but the reflection of the scariest thing I'd ever seen. I was tangibly being consumed by desire, morphing into something I wasn't, desperately wanting to be the guy who fit the mold she had shackled me into, so caught up in her image of perfection that I could barely remember who I had been just weeks ago. And the worst part? As I fled the party, a larger part of me knew Claire deserved someone who was genuinely themselves, not a puppet dancing to her whims. Yet, as I stood outside, the icy night air biting through my shirt, I realized I may have lost her forever, and that left me empty, slowly unraveling at the seams as the laughter behind me faded like smoke in the wind, clutching desperately to the shards of who I once was while a haunting whisper echoed in my mind, what if I'd never truly existed at all? I never thought I'd find myself in Howe's low-cost thrift and consignment on a Wednesday afternoon, but when my friend Jessica suggested we check it out, I shrugged it off, desperate to find something, anything, to fill the aching void left behind by my recent breakup. The store looked unassuming from the outside, a faded sign swinging gently over a cracked sidewalk and an endless array of second-hand items crammed inside a dust-coated space dimly lit by flickering fluorescents. As soon as I stepped in, an unsettling chill rushed down my spine, but I dismissed it as the overzealous air conditioning. Rows of clothes hung, some misaligned, all smothered in the musty scent of forgotten memories and regret. A massive, tattered couch greeted me, its upholstery faded into an unrecognizable color, with an uneasy stillness that seemed to beg for someone to sit down and engage, but I knew better. Curious whispers filtered through the narrow aisles. I followed Jessica into a back room filled with shelves stacked with trinkets, old toys, and books whose spines cracked like the dried trees of a dying forest. As we rifled through the items, I noticed a small, ornate mirror. It caught my reflection, but I looked different, hollow, like a ghost of my former self. When I turned away, I felt an odd warmth, as if the mirror was trying to anchor itself to me, and the feeling was unnerving. "Look at this," Jessica exclaimed, holding up an ancient-looking photo album, its cover barely intact. The faded images inside were mostly unrecognizable, but one photo caught my eye, an old woman seated in a dense forest, her penetrating gaze fixed directly at the camera. I felt an odd connection to her, as if she saw through layers of pretense and into the very web of my soul. "Who do you think she is?" I asked Jessica, staring into the woman's photograph as if it held secrets of the universe. "Just some old lady," she shrugged, tossing it back onto the shelf. But I couldn't shake it off. Frustrated, I wandered to the other side of the room, unease turning my stomach like a worm writhing in dirt. Among the clutter, I rummaged through an assortment of ceramic pots when a voice, raspy and barely above a whisper, slithered into my ear, "Take me home." I whipped around. Jessica was too far away, completely lost in her finds, and the air in the room thickened like syrup. My heart raced, and with a growing sense of dread, I turned back to where the voice emanated, the mirror. My breath hitched as I realized it was now angled unnaturally as though it had shifted to speak to me. My thoughts screamed for me to leave, but there was a strange allure in the way the surface shimmered. Before I made a run for it, the reflection intensified, swirling like dark water, and I watched, horrified, as the old woman stepped through the shimmer, her visage twisting with grotesque clarity. The voice returned, more demanding this time. I said, "Take me home." Instinct kicked in as I collided with an array of dusty shelves, knocking over a few items, desperately sprinting toward the exit. I burst outside into the daylight, gasping for fresh air, convinced it was a simple mirage conjured by my overstimulated mind, but the dusty film on my hands felt too real. "Did you find anything cool?" Jessica asked, roaming out with her arms full of items, a faint judgment in her eyes. "I might have found something," I muttered under my breath, adrenaline still thrumming in my ears. Half my heart insisted I needed that mirror, needed to delve into the darkness it promised, but the other half, that half suffocating in fear, pulled me swiftly away. As we walked back to her car, I felt the ancient tug of the mirror, whispering softly, "You'll be back." Walking through the door of my apartment later that night, I kicked off my shoes and tried to shake off the strange encounter. I distracted myself with Netflix, but flashes of the old woman danced through my mind. Hours passed, darkness blanketing the entire room. Just as I began to drift to sleep, a sudden crash jolted me awake, reverberating through my chest. I stumbled into the kitchen, the chilling memory of the mirror still clinging to me, and there, I froze in terror. A small ceramic pot that I had slipped into my bag was rolling, almost mocking me. I rushed to where it lay, shattering into pieces, exposing a small charred piece of fabric. Startled, I picked it up, my hands trembling. As I held it up to the light, I squinted, recognizing the faded pattern as one from the old woman's dress. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my coffee table. Something was horrifically off. The longer I thought about it, the more trapped I felt. Paranoia crept over me. The deeper it sank, the more I felt lost in a twisted reality I couldn't control. Thinking back to Hal's thrift shop, I slammed the door shut and locked it tight, desperate for sleep, but slumber eluded me that night. Time ticked mercilessly. I lay there listening to the silence, only to be jolted awake every hour by fleeting whispers and the feeling of being watched. The following days blurred, and I found myself pulled closer to Hal's again, a dark compulsion gnawing at the back of my mind. Each day, the sounds of my solitude grew louder, currents of darkness pooled in the cracks of my reality, and despite my rational thoughts screaming against it, I found my feet dragging me back to that cursed store. It was Saturday when I returned, the weight of dread heavy on my chest. Stepping through those doors again felt like a leap into a malevolent void. The air was thick and suffocating, each item around me felt alive, filled with whispers of stories meant to remain untold. I plowed through the aisles, searching for the mirror, like a moth drawn helplessly to a flame. I finally found it, still gleaming, in the exact spot I'd left it. But now, the glass seemed to be alive, pulling at me with an unseen force. Time slipped away as I stared into the depths of it, the surface bubbling as that same withered face emerged. "Took you long enough," she rasped, her voice like ice, cracking through the glass. "You need me," she hissed, and it felt like nails scraping over my mind. "I've waited so long." My heart hammered in my chest as I felt her influence wrap around me like chains. In a moment of horror, I realized this mirror wasn't just a reflection, it was a conduit, a thin membrane between dimensions. "You want your life back?" she continued, her eyes the void of a black hole. "Just give in, and I will make it all better." I staggered back, but I couldn't break the connection. She was pulling at my insides, promising everything I ever lost would return, yet I knew better. My resolve sprang back, igniting a fight within me as I shouted, "No!" She shrieked in fury, the sound echoing through the building like a shattered glass symphony, forcing me to retreat. Somehow, I broke free from her grasp and stumbled through the aisles, desperate to escape, but the very store seemed to shift around me. Despair guided me toward the exit while I could still hear the old woman glitching in and out of sanity behind me, threatening to destroy everything I held dear if I refused her call. I burst through the exit and didn't stop running until my legs burned fiercely, my heart hammering in my chest and the fog of her voice trailing behind me like a sinister specter. I swore I could still hear her cries echoing in my mind, whispering in seductive tones, vowing to take what was mine if I didn't return for her. It's been weeks now. I moved back to my parents' place, replacing solitude with old habits, attempting to forget the day, but she's there when the lights dim. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I feel her presence lurking just beneath the surface, whispering that I will never escape her grasp. The memories of House haunt my waking thoughts, the echoes of promises I can't ignore. I know she waits for me, forever patient, forever hungry, and I can't help but feel I'm destined to return. Every night, as I close my eyes, praying to silence her whispers, I wonder if one day I'll be too weak to resist, drawn back to Hal's low-cost thrift and consignment, where otherworldly darkness glimmers enticingly beneath layers of cheap fabric and forgotten sentiments, ready to engulf me whole. My house is empty. But my friend who is deaf and blind insists someone is here. I know how that sounds. I mean, how could she possibly know? Her name is Lily, and we've been best friends since childhood, bound by a shared sense of adventure and a fierce loyalty that even her disabilities couldn't tarnish. I'd spent many nights at her place, and now that she was staying with me, I figured it was my turn to keep her company. The first few nights were filled with the usual giggles, reminiscing about old memories, and listening to her recount stories about people she could sense even when she couldn't see or hear them. It was during one of those late-night talks that she first mentioned it, the feeling of someone else in the house. I laughed it off, of course. How could I take her seriously? We had just watched a spooky movie that night, and I assumed it was just her imagination running wild as usual. But as the days passed, I noticed something unsettling about her claims. Each night, as we settled down for sleep, she would tense up, her normally calm demeanor slipping away as she whispered to me about shadows dancing in the corners of the room, the faintest shuffling noises that echoed through the silence, and a cold draft that seemed to crawl over her like an unwelcome visitor. I would reassure her, of course, turn on all the lights, and remind her that no one could be there, but her conviction was strong, almost palpable. I can feel them, Ava, she'd insist, her fingers clenching my arm with a grip that bespoke terror. They're watching. I tried everything I could think of to ease her mind. I smudged sage through the house, lit candles, even uploaded soundtracks of relaxing noises to mask any peculiar sounds she might notice. Yet, rather than calming her, my efforts seemed to amplify her unease. It was the third night when she stirred me awake just after midnight, her face pale, fingers shaking. "Someone's here, Ava," she whispered, and I could hear the worry in her normally steady tone. I felt a chill grip my heart as I scanned the dark room, feeling ridiculous for even letting her fears get to me. "Lily, I promise, there's no one here," I said softly, trying to maintain a reassuring composure. But she wouldn't back down. "No, listen. I can sense them closer now." I understood that as a blind and deaf person, different senses amplified for her. She could feel vibrations in the air, shifts in the atmosphere. Under normal circumstances, I would trust her instincts without question, but that night something felt different. That night, the shadows flittered behind the furniture, and I swore I heard faint whispers weaving through the walls. I convinced both of us to turn on the music, drowning out the impending dread trying to creep into my heart. I wanted to protect her, to shield her from whatever horror was lurking in the corners of my home. But by the fifth night, all of my bravado melted into anxiety. Lily wouldn't stop talking about it. "They want something," she kept insisting, trembling with fear. "They're reaching for me." I started spiraling down a rabbit hole of dark thoughts. Maybe something had followed us from the last place we visited, or perhaps I was blind to something sinister lurking behind my familiar walls. One eerie morning, while making tea, an almost primal urge made me turn off the kettle and listen, truly listen. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart raced as I contemplated what it could be. Lily stood by the window, her head tilted ever so slightly, and I could see her fingers curling as if attempting to grasp the air itself. "Can you hear that, Ava?" she asked, the tremor in her voice cutting through my resolve like a blade. I shook my head, trying to uphold my act of comfort. "It's just the heat, Lily. Just the pipes clanking." But as I spoke those words, I felt myself slipping away from my own sanity. The world twisted into hues of gray, and the tapping became a low thrum that reverberated deep within my skull. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard it again, this time, louder and more pronounced, a scratching sound that sent shivers racing down my spine. I glanced over at Lily, her face mirrored my own dread, eyes wide and alert, body rigid as if she were listening for something only she could understand. I realized now that the atmosphere had thickened around us, and each breath I took felt heavy laden with despair. I wanted to shake the feeling off, to convince both of us that she was misinterpreting her environment, but each night it returned, more pronounced, insistent. The ghosts of doubt began to haunt my thoughts. What if she couldn't see what I could? What if she was the only one who could really feel it? On the seventh night, something changed. I woke to find her standing in the middle of the room, her hands extended in front of her like she was grasping for something ethereal. "Ava," she called softly, "I think they want me to come." Panic coursed through my veins, ice creeping into my heart. "Lily, don't, stay with me," I cried, but her expression was one of calm, of unwarranted trust in the shadows encircling her. As I lunged to grab her shoulders, she spun around, her eyes vacant yet somehow laced with understanding. "Don't you see? They need me. Suddenly, it struck me that the whispers had grown louder, coiling around my ears, and I could sense the change in the atmosphere as if a heavy fog rolled in, pulling the very essence of light from the room. I felt consumed by darkness, and in that suffocating haze, the last semblance of reason slipped away. I could see now, a vague shape lurking just beyond the periphery, slinking toward us, and I was helpless as my screams echoed back at me, muted and redundant. As I gripped Lily's arm, she snapped back to me. "They're here," she whispered, "they want to play." And just like that, reality cracked open, and the shadows surged forward, swallowing us whole into a world we never wanted to enter. It's dark here now, and I can't tell what's real. Lily's silence is deafening, but the whispers, they haven't stopped. They're still telling me to let go, that my house is, after all, no longer empty. It's filled with those who wish to be seen, to be heard, those who never left. I never thought I would find myself sitting on the edge of a crumbling bed, clutching the frayed edges of my sanity, wondering how I ended up in a hell of my husband's making. It all started innocently enough with a comment from Linda, our neighbor, who would often pop over for tea, her laughter infectious and loud, but one day, she gazed at my husband Sam with a strange glimmer in her eye and said he had an uncanny charm, how she could just see him headlining her dreams, and I brushed it off, attributing it to her bubbly nature, but later, I found her outside our house, just watching him as he tended to our garden, her expression a mix of longing and something darker that sent a chill down my spine. Sam, ever oblivious, shrugged off her adoration, but a few weeks later, he came home one evening with something small and tightly wrapped in an old handkerchief, a gift, he said, smiling wider than I had seen in years as he revealed it to be a mask, only it didn't look like any mask I had seen at Halloween or any party. It was too real, too detailed, and I could almost feel the pulse of the skin stretched over the hollow, lifeless form, and when I asked where it came from, he laughed it off, saying it was simply a collectible from a garage sale, but each day, he seemed more entranced by it, studying the shadows under the eyes, the way the lips caught the light, and my heart began to rumble with unease when I noticed that he was spending more and more time across the street, staring at Linda's house, and one night, driven by an instinct I couldn't ignore, I slipped outside, careful not to wake him, and there, crouching against her porch like a vulture waiting for a feast, was Sam, donning the mask. He looked familiar yet unrecognizable, the contours of her face melding with his, merging into something grotesque, and I stumbled back into the darkness, my breath hitching in my throat, knowing that the love I once held was churning into something vile, that he had somehow become more than my husband. He had become a collector, a scavenger of identities, and as days grew into weeks and weeks into nights marred by nightmares filled with blood and whispers, my phone buzzed with frantic messages from neighbors. Linda had gone missing, and instead of feeling horror, I felt anger bubble to the surface because this wasn't just about her, it was about me. Was I the one meant to be hidden, too? Why did he choose others' faces over mine, when I had given him everything? And so the next day, I confronted Sam, demanded to know where she was. But he smiled that disarming smile that once melted my heart and instead spoke of a desire for transformation, told me that he was merely trying on their beauty, and it felt as if each word draped thick fashion fabric over my will to disagree, swallowing my cries as the pieces clicked into place. He had become something I could no longer comprehend and slipped into the very essence of horror stories I had dismissed as fiction. My reality warped into his nightmarish masquerade, but desperation clawed at me, and I started my own investigation. Digging deeper into her life, uncovering the last people to see her alive, revealing dark veins that coursed through our neighborhood, until finally, I stumbled upon a hidden online forum, a secret gathering of those who practice the same strange and malevolent hobby, their faces hidden, their usernames cloaked in mystery. But as I scrolled through posts of people sharing tales of uncanny resemblances and altered lives, I froze, recognizing Linda in a photo sitting between two men. It was practically a shrine to the obsession I was beginning to fear, the way they all quite literally wore their victims like trophies, and it struck me like a lightning bolt, fear spiraling cruelly within me that my husband wasn't the only one in on this twisted game, that I, too, was just another canvas for his art. And late that night, I crept to our bedroom, each creak of the floor making my heart thump violently against my rib cage, watching him sleep, the mask laid out on the bedside table, its hollow eyes watching. I snatched it up and bolted for the door, but I should have known he'd wake. He lunged at me with a flurry of rage, eyes wild and desperate as he screamed my name, a sound that cut through the silence of the night like glass. and I fumbled with my keys, my palms slick with sweat, adrenaline tearing my mind apart, drowning me in fear as I fought with him, but he grabbed my arm, twisting it in a way that shattered my sense of reality, his voice slithering into my ears as he chanted words I couldn't make out, only feeling the presence of an entity in the room, something dark and ancient, and in that moment, I realized that I wasn't fighting just for my life but for my entire existence. So as terror wrapped its icy fingers around my throat, I broke free and hurled it over the porch railing into the night like a lifeline, not knowing if it was the mask or the love that was truly cursed, tearing away the last threads of sanity in that moment, screeching like an animal. But now the silence that followed felt even worse than the chaos of earlier. I turned back to the house, trembling, calling his name, and it echoed back to me, a haunting whisper that promised I would not escape. Not yet. I was bound to a game I had never agreed to play, all of it spiraled beyond my control. When I finally dashed around to the backyard, breathless, I found my salvation, or so I thought. A massive garden shed, rusted and forgotten, squealed open beneath the tug of my frantic hands, revealing dozens of faces hanging like eerie decor, warped smiles and vacant eyes glaring at me. But it was not the variety of visceral horror that struck me still, it was her face, Linda, her features stripped and raw, carefully mounted above a grotesque faux mantle as if she were the crown jewel in this horrid collection, and I could almost make out the memories that should have lived behind those eyes, memories of laughter, friendship, life. One last scream bubbled from my throat as stark pain shot through me, and at that moment, Sam burst through the door, eyes black, face morphing into something I no longer recognized, wearing my fear like a mask, and as I stumbled back, I understood what it truly meant to wear another's face. It was more than skin. It was an unending hunger, a perpetual greed for the essence of those who still walked the earth, and I was left standing, paralyzed with all the faces of those who had disappeared, feeling their spirits clawing at me, begging me to run. But wherever I would go, whatever I would do, Sam would remain there in the shadows of my mind, reminding me that I was merely one more face in a portrait of horror, and now it was my turn to wear the mask. I just hadn't realized that in the end, I would find myself lost among them, forever searching for a face to call my own. I work in the IT department of a mid-sized company, and when Marissa went missing last month, her absence left an undeniable void. She was more than just a coworker, she was the vibrant pulse of the office, cracking jokes that sliced through the monotony of our cubicles and organizing our chaotic schedules with the precision of a seasoned conductor. But my concerns morphed into an eerie curiosity when I discovered an unsent email in her drafts folder while troubleshooting her account, the cursor blinking in a way that felt almost alive. It was addressed cryptically to a name I didn't recognize. "Hello, Alex," it began, and as I continued reading, a chill took residence in my bones, the message oscillating between mundane office chatter and something profoundly unsettling as Marissa spoke of receiving strange phone calls at odd hours, each time ending with a voice whispering her name, promising to show her the truth behind a secret that shouldn't exist. I leaned closer, my heartbeat quickening, my surroundings fading into the background as I scrolled deeper into the message, her doubts manifesting into frantic words as she mentioned shadows shifting in her peripheral vision and emails arriving that contained nothing but hyperlinks to dark websites, each link leading to images of a faceless figure that mirrored her every move. The last few lines sent a jolt through my mind, where she revealed the sense of being watched, a growing dread that had replaced her usual spark with paranoia, and she implored Alex to look over her shoulder, to please, just trust me, penned in an unsettling haste that seemed to bleed edged letters. Against my better judgment, a wave of dread pushed me onwards, forcing me to snoop through her drafts even more, and I uncovered another email, this one drafted the night before she vanished. It read like a frantic confession, a plea for help, and I could feel the gravity of her fear hanging in the air as she described finding a hidden camera in her workspace. Every time she felt that wretched chill crawl up her spine, accompanying the unseen eyes that trailed her. "I think they know," she said, words heavy with an unending urgency, and soon a wave of nausea struck me, the realization creeping in as I scanned her unfulfilled thoughts about reporting it to HR or confronting the faceless watchers sprawled across the world outside her office doors, but she never did take that step, her last words hauntingly echoing in my mind, "I can't escape it. It's everywhere." As I fought to control the racing thoughts flooding my consciousness, with adrenaline surging through my veins as I realized that the elaborate connections she was weaving were more than just figments of fear, they were playing out in real time as I started to notice my own office environment morphing subtly, the fluorescent lights humming louder, casting shadows in corners that flickered with unwarranted movement, and the whispers in my head began to mimic hers, taunting me with questions I wasn't willing to answer. Against all reason, I felt compelled to confront this Alex, whoever he was, and the online search revealed little, just a ghost haunting the edges of social media. No picture, no presence, merely an untraceable shadow lurking within her life, and there was a growing knot in my stomach as another email popped up, this one an automatic notification of an incoming call, routed directly to me by some twist of fate. The caller ID simply read unknown, and it felt like the universe was challenging me, my hands trembling while I raised the receiver to my ear, when a shaky breath fell through the line followed by that same whisper, "Just look behind you," sending shivers down my spine as I turned instinctively toward my office door, only to find nothing but emptiness echoed back at me, the oppressive silence thickening around me, while my body wrestled with the primal urge to run. Yet I was fixed in place, lips dry as I hesitated, knowing I was tethering onto a frightening edge, and in that absence of noise, I clawed through my mind to dismiss the shadows as tricks of light. Still, the very moment I returned to my computer, another message appeared on Marissa's drafts, and my guts churned as I recognized the unmistakable echo of insanity as her fingers had captured the unfathomable. She spoke of nightmares that had begun consuming her thoughts, voices clasping her mind in a tight grip, warning her that the truth was coming, and it wasn't something she could run from. My body ached in protest, begging me to abandon this twisted thread of morbid curiosity, but a feeling that I couldn't place, maybe guilt or an insatiable hunger for understanding, pulled me deeper into her unraveling psyche and urged me to send a response, just an anonymous inquiry that begged her to tell me more, to share whatever she knew, my fingers dancing over the keyboard as I crafted a few sentences of concern, but I felt the prickling sensation creep back again, the awareness washing over me that I was no longer just an anonymous helper. I had crossed a threshold into a terrifying venture. Just as I hit send, I felt the air binding me thicken, a strange sense of impending dread curling in my chest, and I realized in that moment, the hauntings might not be confined to Marissa's fractured mind, but I had invited whatever was stalking her into my world, and almost as soon as the words left my screen, the fluorescent lights blinked once, twice, then cut out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic ensued, and in the frantic effort to gather my thoughts, I heard it again, the voice whispering intimately through the dark, "You were curious, now let's see how you'll survive watching." It was a chilly evening when I decided to visit my brother's house, a dilapidated old thing nestled at the end of a long, twisted road on the outskirts of our small town. The locals talked about it in hushed tones, claiming it was haunted, but I never believed in that sort of thing. As I approached, the trees seemed to loom overhead, their gnarled branches grabbing at the fading light, making shadows that danced unnaturally against the weathered walls. I noticed the front door was ajar, a crack of darkness that beckoned me inside. I called out for my brother, Daniel, but only silence answered back. It felt wrong, like the air was thick with something I couldn't understand. As I stepped over the threshold, uneasy instincts prickled at the back of my neck. The living room was a mess, upturned furniture, shattered glass, and a thick layer of dust that implied no one had been here in ages, which wasn't right because Daniel should have been home. My heart raced as I ventured deeper into the house, calling his name again, my voice echoing in the eerie silence. It was then that I noticed a strange smell. I followed it down the dark hallway, my gut twisting with every step. The walls felt alive, almost pulsating with a strange energy, and I could hear a low hum that seemed to vibrate beneath my feet. My heart sank as I approached the door to his room. It was slightly ajar. Pushing it open with a trembling hand, I was hit by that smell again, rusty and earthy, like iron and dirt intertwined. The scene inside was like something ripped from a nightmare. There, in the center of the room, lay Daniel, his body grotesquely contorted. But it was his head that had me frozen in place. It was gone, completely twisted off, as if something had taken it and spun it like a corkscrew. My mind raced as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. My brother's lifeless body sprawled out, no blood, just an overwhelming sense of wrongness that permeated the air. I backed out, ready to run, when I noticed something glinting in the shadows, his head, resting against the wall, hollow eyes staring blankly at me. Chilled to the core, I hesitated, and that's when I saw it, a dark figure standing in the corner of the room, its shape almost human but with limbs that twisted and writhed unnaturally, like they were made of shadows. It grinned at me with a mouth that stretched too wide, revealing a set of sharp, glimmering teeth. I turned to flee, but the air grew thick around me, and I stumbled, crashing into the doorframe as panic consumed me. I heard it whisper my name, my brother's voice twisted into something horrid, echoing in my ears as I managed to push myself through the door and into a hallway. It followed, a slithering shadow that hovered just out of reach. I sprinted down the stairs, the floor creaking beneath every desperate step, my hands trembling as I threw open the front door. As I burst outside, I could feel it at my back, its icy breath prickling my skin. My car was a beacon of escape, but as I fumbled for my keys, I dared to glance back when a sickening crack of laughter filled the air. That creature, that thing wearing my brother's face, was looming over me. Filled with dread, I jumped into my car, slamming the door shut and screaming as my mind raced with thoughts of what could have done this to him. I sped away, heart racing, and didn't stop until I reached my own home miles down the road. My hands shook as I dialed the police, reporting my brother missing and the chaos I had discovered in his home, praying someone would believe me. The officer on the line sounded skeptical, but promised to send a unit. Hours later, they arrived and listened to my frantic ramblings, but when we got back to the house, there was no sign of the grotesque scene I had witnessed. Everything was perfectly in place, just a regular, old house with dust in the corners and creaks in the floorboards. There was no trace of my brother, no sign of his head, no sinister shadow lurking in the corners. They thought I was losing my mind, but I knew what I had seen. For weeks afterward, I searched for answers, scouring the town's library and old records, desperate to uncover any history about the house or my brother's past. One night, a name leapt out at me from an aged newspaper, an unsolved murder from decades ago, a boy decapitated in what was assumed to be a ritualistic slaying, the murderer never caught. Chills danced along my spine as I realized that the house had been built on those dark grounds. It was not just a decaying structure, it was a cursed vessel. That night, when I lay in bed, sleep eluded me. Then, seconds away from finally dozing off, I heard it, a hushed whisper, haunting and familiar. "Come find me." It was Daniel's voice, and it felt like ice running through my veins. I leapt up, breathing heavily as I gripped my phone, contemplating a call for help. But instead, I found myself pulling on a coat, driven by a force I didn't understand, returning to the house once more. Stepping inside felt like stepping into a different realm. The scent of iron hung thick in the air, and this time, I was not alone. The walls throbbed with a pulse that matched my heart, a synchronicity that drew me deeper into the abyss. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices merging into a single chilling sound that brought me to the room where my brother had met his end. But now, it was different. The walls bled darkness, and in the center of the room, I saw it. The figure stood as if waiting for me. It raised an arm, beckoning me closer, and on an impulse I didn't understand, I stepped forward. There, silhouetted against the swirling shadows, I saw my brother's head once more, its gaze pouring into me with an intensity that almost felt alive. "Help me," it pleaded, and I felt a surge of overwhelming emotion. But before I could react, the figure lunged, faster than I could react, and in an instant, everything blurred. Lights flashed before my eyes, and I felt myself spinning, as if caught in a cyclone of darkness. I landed hard on the floor, disoriented and breathless. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but it was gone. Daniel's head, the figure, the whispers, all vanished as if they had never been there. I was alone in the room, the silence now deafening, and just as panic surged through me, I looked down to see something chilling, the reflection of my own head twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide with terror, and I realized with horror that I had become something grotesque, something twisted by the very darkness that had claimed my brother. In that moment of clarity, I understood the truth. I would never find him, he was part of it now, just a voice amongst whispers in a house that would forever call for blood. I had always considered myself to be a sensible person, but over the past few weeks, I found my life spiraling into an unspeakable terror that started innocently enough when my roommate Jake began acting a little strange. Sure, we all have off days, but this was different. He seemed off, like his energy had shifted. He'd sit for hours staring at the walls, with an empty expression on his face that I had never seen before, and then he'd return to normal as if a light had switched back on. At first, I shrugged it off, telling myself he was just stressed from work. But then the little things began to disturb me, a lingering scent of something rotten that clouded the air at night, a chilling presence spreading through our suddenly quiet apartment. The day it peaked was a Saturday, when I returned home after a long shift at the diner. Jake was there, standing in the living room, staring blankly at the television, the screen flashing images of a documentary about ancient civilizations. I shivered at the sight of him. His hair was disheveled, a pale sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, and his favorite hoodie, usually so clean, now hung off him like he'd been wearing it for days without a wash. I thought about nudging him, asking if he was okay, but the way he focused on the flickering lights made me hesitate. Instead, I went to my room, intent on putting the troubling sight out of my mind. However, as the night wore on and the shadows in our living room deepened, Jake knocked on my door. When I opened it, my breath hitched. I could see the outline of his figure, but even in the dim light, something felt wrong. "Hey, are you busy?" he asked with a crooked smile, which didn't feel like the smile I knew, but one that floated awkwardly on his face. Not really," I replied, suddenly feeling a surge of unease. Before I knew it, he was in my room, sitting on the edge of my bed. We began talking about mundane things, school and the latest streaming recommendations, but every time I caught his eyes, it felt like the light behind them was flickering, trying to break through a thin veneer of something sinister. As the conversation flowed, I felt a magnetic pull toward him, like something deep within me wanted to bridge the gap between our friendship and something more. He leaned in, whispering the most alluring words that wrapped around my sanity like a warm blanket, and before I realized what was happening, I found myself entangled in a passionate embrace, thoughts clouded with desire, the world outside muffled by our breaths. We shared the bed, where all the tension previously felt snapped like a stretched rubber band. My thoughts spiraled into lustful questions as skin met skin, bodies colliding under the sheets. But even as we kissed, I couldn't shake the feeling he was slightly off. The way he moved, with a practiced fluidity that sent shivers down my spine, felt rehearsed, like a macabre film script. Salt from my tears mingled with the sweat between us, commingling the sweetness of ecstasy with the saltiness of fear. As exhaustion overcame my senses, I drifted into an uneasy sleep, a dreamless void overtaking me, stripped of consciousness. When dawn broke, the sunlight filtered into the room, illuminating the figure beside me that was no longer Jake but a grotesque mimicry of him, its skin stretched over exaggerated features, but still, those eyes, ever haunted and hollow, now gleamed with a malicious glow that sent spikes of panic rushing through me. I jolted upright, breath quickening as I scanned the room, but the monster beside me didn't move, it just stared, calm and poised, like a predator waiting for its prey to awaken. My stomach churned, and the memory of last night's intoxicating embrace filled me with dread. "What are you?" I whispered, fighting against a scream, my heart pounding wildly against my chest. But the abomination only chuckled, a softly sinister sound that echoed in my mind. "I'm your roommate," it said, but the voice was wrong, gravelly, twisted, dripping with something unrecognizable. Panic surged anew as I shot out of bed, heading for the door, ready to flee, but it spoke again, smoothly manipulating the air between us. "No need to run. I know you like what you see, we just had a wonderful night together." I froze, disgust swelling in my throat as the horror of what I had done crashed over me. There was no escaping. In a heartbeat, it lunged from the bed, a monstrous shadow wrapping around me, suffocating and intoxicating. My thoughts spun as I clawed at the door, desperate to escape, but it grabbed my wrist with bone-crushing strength. "You could have me forever. Imagine a life where you never have to be alone again." I screamed, the sound warped as it filled my throat, and I thrashed against its grip, but with nightmarish ease, it pulled me close. Everything clicked, that strange smell I'd noticed was only now apparent, a decay that hung in the air like ripe fruit going rotten. "Let me go," I cried, tearing myself from its grasp. I hurled myself through the door and staggered down the hallway, not daring to look back. I threw myself out into the sunlight, panting heavily, desperate for anything resembling safety, but all I could think of was the horrific realization, I had shared my most vulnerable moment with an imposter, and now, deep in the recesses of my mind, I wondered, what if Jake was gone for good, and this thing was only the beginning? With a dread deeper than anything I had ever felt, I glanced at my phone, recalling the last message Jake sent before everything unraveled. "I think something's wrong with me." As I stood there paralyzed in uncertainty, I felt an unsettling presence behind me, and my heart sank. I could never run far enough to escape what had already taken root in my life. My husband keeps calling me Judy. But that's not my name, and I'm afraid for my life. It started innocently enough, a slip of the tongue during a quiet dinner at home. "Pass the salt, Judy," he said, his eyes flicking to me with a warmth that had melted my heart a million times before. I chuckled, thinking he was joking, because we both knew I was Claire, but the laugh died in my throat when I caught the strange glint in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years, a coldness that hung there like a shadow. I shrugged it off, hoping he was merely tired, and when he did it again the next day, saying, "Judy, darling, what's for breakfast?" I felt a prickling unease twitch across my spine. The more he did it, the more concerned I became, but nothing could prepare me for the night that would shatter my life. After a week of the name-calling that had morphed from cute to sinister, I confronted him, while I fidgeted nervously with the frayed edges of my sweater. "Honey, I think you meant Claire," I said, my voice trembling slightly, barely meeting his gaze. He paused, the fork he was using to poke at his food paused midair, and then he smiled slowly, a smile that seemed more like a grimace, as he leaned toward me, the air suddenly heavy. "No, I meant Judy. I always have." There was something unsettling about how he said it. It was as if that name was more than just a nickname, but a commandment, a reality he had crafted in a world only he inhabited. Panic bubbled in my throat, but I managed to muster a laugh, attempting to brush it off, figuring perhaps it was all some strange joke I wasn't a part of. I should have called my sister, should have told her about this bizarre name mix-up, but the words died before they reached my lips because my instincts screamed at me to stay quiet. Day turned to night, and fear transformed into dread as the nights grew longer and our conversations grew shorter. He lingered at odd hours, a candlelight flickering against the wall, illuminating the creases in his brow that hadn't been there just a month ago. He seemed consumed by something invisible, and every time he repeated my name, or rather, Judy, I felt a part of myself splinter, break off. Then came the night when I awakened to find him sitting beside me, the moonlight reflecting off his eyes, giving them an otherworldly shimmer. "You know, Judy," he whispered, an unsettling grin spreading across his face, "you really should remember who you are." Alarmed but emboldened, I whipped my head toward him, the words tumbling from my mouth like marbles in a game I didn't know I was playing. "I'm not Judy, I'm Claire. Please stop." But he just laughed, a sound that chilled me to my bones, and the laughter morphed into something more primal, a growl that filled the dim room. "The longer you pretend, the harder it will become for you," he hissed, leaning closer until I could smell the sharp tang of his breath. I recoiled from him, dread pooling in my gut as I recalled all those times when he had rushed out late at night under the guise of work, and all the subtle changes I had brushed aside, the odd phone calls, the sudden lack of intimacy. They weren't simply signs of stress, they were the groundwork for something darker. I scrambled out of bed, driven by instinct as I pulled my phone from the nightstand, my hands shaking as I dialed my sister's number. The ringing seemed to last an eternity, but just as the line clicked twice, the lights flickered, and he was there, looming in the doorway, an apparition sculpted from fear. "You shouldn't be contacting anyone, Judy. They won't understand," he said, each word dripping with a sinister promise that sent a cold rush of terror deep into my core. In that moment, the reality of my situation crashed over me. I wasn't just caught in a twisted nickname game, I was caught in a web of a man who had fashioned a nightmare in our home. I dropped the phone as he advanced on me, and I scrambled away, heart racing as adrenaline surged through my veins. I needed a plan, a way out, some semblance of safety, so I ducked into the bathroom, my mind racing as I considered my options. He banged on the door, his words a mixture of anger and misguided affection. "Judy, you only need to remember. Stop making this harder on yourself." The door shook with force, but I wasn't ready to go down without a fight. I grabbed for something, anything, and my fingers wrapped around the heavy base atop the sink. Gritting my teeth, I braced myself as I swung it against the door, a desperate attempt to deter him. The crash startled him momentarily, and I seized the opportunity to bolt toward the window. My heart thudded violently against my ribcage as I wrestled with the lock, desperate to escape this delusion he'd trapped me within. But the lock wouldn't budge, and behind me, I could hear him laughing again, a low rasp that set my nerves ablaze. "You'll never escape, Judy. You belong here, with me." I finally managed to kick the window open, shards of glass raining silently upon the ground as I threw myself into the night air, landing ungracefully in the overgrown grass below. Stumbling to my feet, I glanced back at the house, at the silhouette of my husband framed by the moonlight, his face twisted into a menacing grin that told me one thing loud and clear: this was far from over. I ran harder than I ever had before, my legs carried by sheer terror as I aimed for the only house that was a beacon of safety in my fugue of confusion. My sister lived a couple of miles away, and although my feet might bleed and my breath threatened to fail, I wouldn't stop until I reached her. Yet as I ran, screams echoing in my mind and my heart thrumming in labored rhythm, I could hear each step behind me, a cadence I couldn't shake off. He was playing a game I no longer understood, and all I could think was, how long until he caught up? Just as I turned a corner, ready to sprint toward safety, I spotted an old house, an abandoned property. Its windows shattered, the lawn overrun with weeds. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, but desperation and instinct pulled me toward the doorway, urging me to hide. I slipped inside, my heart thundering as I nestled behind an old, rotting couch, praying he wouldn't find me. Time dragged, mixed with twisted thoughts of what if he never stopped searching for me, what if he found me here, what if he dragged me back into that hell I had barely escaped. And then I felt a heat near my neck, turning my head slightly to see a figure in the shadows, a face that seemed familiar yet alien, and panic seized me as recognition flickered to life. He was not my husband, he was someone else entirely, someone who had watched me, listened to him call me Judy, and now he was here to finish the twisted narrative that had become my life. I held my breath, heart galloping in my chest as I hid, praying that somehow, my life could dive back into the normalcy of chaos, if I could just escape this nightmare. But then, in that suffocating darkness, as time ticked away and shadows grew longer, I began to wonder, was it the world that had changed, or was it me? Perhaps Judy had never existed at all. Perhaps my husband was simply giving life to a specter, and all along, it was I who had been too blind to see the truth. My name, my very being tugged away from me like a colorful thread pulled by an unseen hand. And as the figure shifted closer, an unholy smile creeping across what could once have been my husband's lips, I realized a chilling truth: if I ever got out of this alive, I might be running forever, unable to uncover the most terrifying possibility of all. What if Claire had ceased to exist in the eyes of the one man I'd loved, and now I was destined to live out the name of someone else, begging for a name that felt like a fading ghost, a cry for help that nobody would answer? I never thought I'd look back on the relationship with my ex-boyfriend, Dennis, as anything more than a painful lesson learned. He was an undeniably intelligent guy, brilliant, even, and yet, he wore his intellect like a crown, constantly seeking validation like a starving man at a feast. It started off charming. I was captivated by his conversations that spun webs of philosophy and science, so intricately woven that I felt lucky to share my evenings with this prodigy. But as time ebbed away, I began to notice the mask he wore would slip, revealing that beneath it lay an unsettling insecurity, an unfathomable abyss masquerading as confidence. It was the little things at first, his irritation when I misunderstood a trivial fact or the way his face flushed red when I dared to offer a correction on his favorite topic. I dismissed my discomfort, attributing it to his quirkiness, yet the unease festered in the corners of our exchanges. One evening, while we were watching a documentary about the mysteries of dark matter, a simple question escaped my lips: but how does that relate to time travel? That was it, his facade shattered. He launched into a tirade about the banality of my question, how I simply didn't understand the complexities of it all, or the fact that surely I'd heard the theories before. It was a verbal torrent crafted to drown my curiosity, drowning out the very essence of what had drawn me to him. No longer could I see Dennis as merely sensitive about his intelligence. This was something far more sinister. That night, a seed of doubt sprouted into something darker. His cut-down spiraled into a labyrinth of pretentious discourse, laced with threats veiled behind supercilious disapproval, turning our living room into a battleground where I felt like the loser in an intellectual wrestling match. I confided in a friend, Emily, who had always seen the glares behind his charm, and she warned me, maybe I should consider stepping back. I thought I could manage it, but what I didn't know was that my decision to wind down the relationship triggered a downward spiral. It was as if I had shattered his delicate understanding of the world when I dared to leave him, and that by simply existing, I had become the enemy to his precious self-worth. The final straw came one cold evening, the air heavy with the dread of what I knew Dennis was capable of. I had been letting words fall from my mouth without thinking, and during an innocent conversation about our future, I absent-mindedly expressed that I felt as though my desires were suffocating beneath his ego. His reaction was instantaneous. Fury darkened his blue eyes, bubbling beneath the surface like molten lava. It wasn't long before the arguments escalated, each one more ferocious and suffocating than the last, and soon enough, his words twisted relentlessly into rancorous blades. His magnitude of rage terrified me, and my laughter turned to tears, my pleas drowned beneath his torrent of cutting remarks. Finally, I gathered the courage to pack my things, to sever the coils that bound us. Just as the door clicked locked behind me, I stole a glance back, and I swore I saw something darker than just love lost in his expression, malevolence. Weeks passed, I began to breathe again, unaware of how the shadow of his parting wrath hung heavily over me. I hadn't yet cut my ties though, not fully. Dennis had kept a store of my belongings, an old jacket, some books I'd loaned him, and I knew he expected me to come back for them. Something about the remnants of a past life kept him tethered to the hope that I would crawl back. A week later, curiosity sliced through my hesitation, and I thought perhaps a visit would give me closure. After all, how bad could it be? So, there I was, at his door, the air thick with tension as I knocked, and the memory of his laughter echoed in the recesses of my mind, but instead of the warm welcome I envisioned, my heart sank as he opened the door and a wave of icy contempt washed over me, his eyes narrowed like slits. "What do you want?" he sneered, and for a split second, I felt that drowning sensation constrict my chest once again. "Just my things, Dennis," I replied, forcing steadiness into my voice. His face twisted, a mask of calculated disdain, and he stepped back, an invitation laced with malice. The atmosphere grew thick as I entered his realm, filled with my memories still clinging around the faded wallpaper. The silence was deafening as I gathered my belongings, turned toward the door. But a sudden movement in the corner of my eye made me freeze. A collection of strange books lined the shelves, their titles glittering in the dim light, titles that resonated uneasily with me, almost mystical. "I've been doing some reading," he said, a hint of manic pride leaking through his menace. Each tome seemed rooted in the occult, dark sciences intertwined with forbidden knowledge, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "You should see what I've learned," he continued, joy draped in darkness, memories of punchy, sharp debates overlaying the foreboding words. "It's different now, you'd be amazed by what's possible when you delved into the nothingness, how reality shifts beneath your feet." I moved toward the door, but his voice wrapped around me, a serpent coiling tighter. "You never believed in my brilliance, did you?" "Not really. But you're about to witness something incredible." I didn't wait to hear more. I burst through the door, heart racing, and as I stumbled into the chilly air, something in the back of my mind screamed that I had underestimated him. I didn't return to check on my things. I couldn't risk another encounter. Days turned to months, but Dennis' figure cast long shadows in my dreams, taunting me with glimpses of what lay beyond the veil of reality, a malignant brilliance born from wounded pride. It began with whispers, my name echoing through the night while I wrestled with restless thoughts, the sheer volume of ideas crashing against my eardrums, clashing against the silence of the dark. Each night, the bad memories blended with his unnatural knowledge, transforming into vivid nightmares where his intellect became a weapon of torment, dissecting my psyche until I felt flesh and bone where my mind used to be. I tried to shake these dreams, igniting small fires of resolve to erase him from my thoughts, but the visions only intensified. I became convinced he was out there, devising some revenge fired by the fury of a bruised ego and intellect unchallenged. A month later, I stumbled upon an article online about a certain scientific experiment gone awry, a lab filled with fuming chemicals, forbidden substances, reshaping the world in ways men weren't meant to understand. My heart raced, the name of the scientist behind it was all too familiar. I closed my eyes, his laughter ringing painfully in my ears, as I envisioned what lay ahead. Dennis had willingly plunged into madness for his own warped sense of enlightenment, and I was the final calculation in his twisted experiments, his legacy. Suddenly, it all clicked. He had wanted me to watch this unravel. The crescendo of paranoia seized me, and the next night served as the connecting thread, that same whisper again, sharper and closer. My courage wavered, urging my body to jump out from under the glaring moonlight. But the moment I opened my blinds and met those eyes, reflective pools of insanity, I gasped as my own reflection shattered within them. Dennis stood outside, looking ever the part of a deranged scholar brimming with knowledge, and somewhere deep in that abyss, his genius sparkled like a diamond over the skewed reflections of shallow notions of love. "You thought you were free?" he hissed, and I knew, he had become something beyond me, transcendent. My heart screamed in quiet desperation, and as shadows of what had been consumed the remnants of my will, it occurred to me that I was no longer a person but a mere witness to a world created by his twisted mastery, trapped within an intelligence far beyond mortality, and I understood then, some truths remain hidden for a reason, and in this twisted dance, I was the final step in his dark waltz into the unknown. For as long as I could remember, the annual company award ceremony had us all on edge, but it wasn't the accolades or the company recognition that terrified us, it was the ominous legend surrounding one particular award, the Golden Employee of the Year, a title that brought with it a twisted curse. My co-workers whispered about it in hushed tones during break times, a pact formed out of sheer survival instinct. The nominees who dared to stand in the spotlight often ended up facing indescribable horrors that stripped away their sanity, possibly even their lives. Stories circulated about those who won in previous years, how they seemed normal until the moment they were handed that golden statue, only to disappear days later or descend into horrific madness. A colleague had shared how one winner spent every night pacing his apartment, convinced he could hear something scratching behind the walls, until he was found in the morning, his eyes wide and mouth agape, like he'd seen something no one else had. When it was announced that I was nominated this year, my heart sank. I laughed it off in front of my team to mask my growing dread, but even I could feel a phantom weight on my chest, an invisible menace curling around my thoughts. In the days leading up to the ceremony, I noticed my coworkers had begun to distance themselves from me, exchanging uneasy glances and avoiding conversations. They probably thought I would be next, destined to join the ranks of the lost, and the fear was palpable, infecting the air like a disease. The night of the ceremony, I sat in front of the stage, reeling from anxiety as I watched the faces of my peers flash with a mixture of hope and terror. I could barely pay attention as each award was handed out. My mind replayed the tales, envisioning shadows lurking behind the applause, my imagination painting them with grotesque features that would haunt my dreams. When my name was finally called, I rose mechanically, almost as if in a trance, the spotlight hitting me like a dagger. I forced a smile, but deep in my gut, the ancient warning echoed louder than the applause around me: don't let them hand you the trophy. As I approached the podium, I swore I felt the air shift, a cold draft raking down my spine, and for just a heartbeat, I glimpsed something grotesque seeping from the edges of the stage, a fleeting shadow lurking in the corner, watching. I brushed it off as nerves, hoping the statue wasn't a harbinger, but when the CEO handed me the award, our fingers brushed, and an electric shock ran through me, folding in on itself like smoke. The moment felt suspended, and a flash of panic hit me when I caught sight of the smirk on his face. It was a knowing smirk, as if he'd seen countless others before me succumb, understood the weight of the statue, the doom wrapped in gold, and my heart raced as I forced myself to smile at the crowd, who were all now clapping like they were at some ghastly ceremony, a celebration of suffering. In the days following, I gripped the statue as if it were a talisman, but it felt more like a curse, taunting me from my desk as the world outside began to contort. Shadows stretched longer, whispers echoed louder, and every night I woke up gasping, the specters of past winners leering at me from the corners of my mind. Desperate, I started researching the stories, tracing the threads of each previous winner, only to discover disturbing patterns. They all became obsessed with their work, consumed by a relentless need to prove they were deserving of the title, and just like that, the madness seeped into their lives. I tried to resist, I tried to live normally, but work became a fog. My colleagues' laughter turned to muffled whispers, and I often found myself staring at that dreaded trophy late at night, questioning whether I would meet the same fate as those who had come before me, until I finally couldn't take it anymore. One night, I gathered my resolve and called an old colleague who had survived a close encounter with the curse. He told me the only way to break it was to rid myself of the trophy, to gift it to someone else, but who would take it? My anxiety surged, and that was when I noticed something odd happening at the office. My coworkers began vanishing, one by one, leaving behind confusion, their empty desks mere reminders of their absence. Panic swelled. Was it something I had done? Had I inadvertently become the catalyst for their disappearances? The more I tried to escape the downward spiral, the more oppressive it felt. Paranoia gripped me, and I could no longer separate reality from nightmares. I became convinced the trophy was alive, feeding off my fear, haunting my dreams like a dark puppet master. And I began noticing shadows pooling in the corners of the office, sometimes catching sight of shapes darting just out of view. Soon enough, the event evolved into madness, as one morning one of my remaining coworkers, Sarah, burst into tears, proclaiming the statue had been watching her, spying through her office window at night, its eyes glimmering like hellfire, and I felt my grip on reality fracture. Days blurred into sleepless nights as I tried to outrun the dread, but with each passing hour, Voices whispered of the curse, entreating me to give in to the madness. It was as if we all danced a macabre waltz, inching closer to the edge of something unspeakable. And then, in an act of desperation one fateful evening, after yet another coworker vanished without a trace, I snatched the trophy and fled deep into the woods behind our office. Nature swallowed me whole with its suffocating silence, and I dug a hole beneath the roots of an ancient tree, burying the cursed award with trembling hands, wiping my brow as I finally breathed a sigh of relief, hoping it was over. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a low, echoing chuckle that twisted my stomach, and I spun around, my heart racing, only to be met with shadows swirling and shifting, congealing into the faces of those who had vanished, the winners from years before, their eyes sunken, and their bodies twitching from the years of being trapped in whatever hell had claimed them. I stumbled back, horrified, as they reached for me, whispering promises and warnings of torment, holding out their own awards, Golden Employee of the Year trophies, glinting ominously, the epitome of despair. It became clear, even buried, the curse wouldn't let go of its victims. It wore the faces of the fallen like puppets, all drawn toward me, and as they enveloped me in shadow, I realized with cold clarity that there was no escaping it now. I had become what I feared the most, a mere plaything in this never-ending cycle of horror. The company will have new nominees every year, perhaps even a new winner, but they will never be free. They think they work to win the award, but the truth is, they are merely offering themselves to it, as it whispers, waiting to consume the next soul to take up the mantle of Golden Employee. And now, I am part of that dark legacy, forever entangled in the web woven by ambition and dread, doomed to haunt those who come after me, a silent specter among the living in this twisted office that thrives on the terror of winning. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here I am, typing this at 3 a.m., my heart racing, breath shallow, as I recall the events that led to this desperate moment. It started innocently, our maid, Clara, just another face in the daily grind of my life. My wife, Sarah, was always busy with work, and I'll admit it, I began to notice Clara's smile, her laughter echoing through the quiet halls of our home. At first, it was harmless, stolen glances while she dusted the shelves or the way she'd brush a stray hair from her face as she tidied up the kitchen, but then we crossed a line, that line drawn in the sand we both knew we shouldn't. It was on a Tuesday, as typical as any other day. Sarah was working late, lost in her corporate world while I watched Clara in the soft glow of the afternoon light. One moment led to another, and before we knew it, our bodies were entangled on the living room couch, the guilt intertwining with overwhelming pleasure. I didn't want to, but I was lost, obsessed with the thrill and the sense of danger, a twisted high that came from knowing I could lose it all. And then Sarah came home early, her key rattling in the lock, that dreaded sound echoing within me like a ticking bomb. I barely had time to toss Clara aside, who ducked under the coffee table, and I threw a cocktail of casual innocence over my dark treachery. When Sarah walked in, I plastered on a smile, while my heart felt like a trapped animal, restless within my chest. But what happened next chilled me to the bone. Instead of anger or betrayal, she looked amused. "What are you hiding, Mike?" she asked with a knowing smirk, and it was then I noticed, her eyes were different, a depth within them that felt almost predatory. I glanced to the side, and Clara was still there, trembling with confusion and fear. "Is she in on it too?" Sarah's voice was low, steady, and it sent a shiver running through me. I blinked, my mind was racing, trying to piece it all together, but the strange laughter that came from Clara wasn't what I expected. It was almost as if she knew something I didn't. I tried to play it cool, my voice cracking as I asked, "What do you mean?" But Sarah wasn't fazed. She approached me slowly, her gaze fixated on Clara like a lioness stalking her prey. "I've known for a while about you two. But the maid has something special, doesn't she?" My heart plummeted. It was like Sarah had peeled back my skin and exposed the rawness I was trying to conceal. I wanted to explain, to beg for her understanding, but there was a labyrinth of twisted secrets unraveling before me, and with that amusement came something darker, a sense of danger I didn't recognize. Then Clara said something that froze my blood. "You shouldn't have let her find out," she whispered, her voice shaky, yet laced with a strange confidence. My gut twisted with unease as I watched Sarah's eyes flicker with a knowing glint, and suddenly I understood, the affair was never just about lust, it had transformed into a game where I was woefully unprepared. Unbeknownst to me, Clara wasn't just a maid, she was a pawn in some greater scheme, and Sarah, my wife, was the architect behind it. I tried to find words, but it felt as if I was spiraling into a vortex of madness where each word would chip away at the foundation of what I assumed was my life. My wife began to pace while Clara remained on the ground, caught in the web of our complicity. "What do you think he's going to do, Clara?" I saw the glint of something in Sarah's eyes, a coiled snake just waiting to strike. In that moment, the reality crashed down on me. Sarah had orchestrated everything, and my obsession with Clara was now a perverse puppet show. I was the fool dancing on strings I had no intention of touching. The affair was just a bait, and Clara had been an unwitting participant, lured into a game designed without her knowledge. I fought the rising tide of panic. I could feel the walls closing in like a vice, but there was something immensely strange going on beneath the surface. I could see the connection between Clara and Sarah, a shared look that hinted at some shadowy bond, a secret I couldn't comprehend. I realized then that I was not just having an affair, I was stepping into something much darker, much more sinister than I could ever have anticipated, and I stumbled back, the truth hitting me like a slap. Just as I opened my mouth to confront them, the lights flickered, and darkness swallowed the room whole, cloaking the tension in an eerie silence that was almost palpable. I became acutely aware of breathing, not my own, but a chorus of rhythmic breathing from both women. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but my body froze in place, paralyzed by fear, rooted in the haunting tension woven into the air. Then, in the creeping shadow, I could swear I saw a smirk cross Clara's face, a flicker of something unnerving. Was she in on it all along? A part of me wanted to shout, to unravel this horrid tapestry of lies, but another part recognized the game had already begun, and I was merely a pawn, lost and disoriented in the dark. As the weight of my infidelity and the dawning realization settled on me, I felt a vortex of dread seep into my bones. What was more terrifying than the affair was the realization that I was a prisoner in my own life, trapped by my choices, tangled in an elaborate web of deception, while the two women in front of me closed in like wolves sensing weakness. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I heard a whisper in the dark, a voice laced with malice, unrecognizable but chillingly familiar. "Welcome to the game, Mike." My entire world crumbled, leaving me with a single horrifying thought. This had stopped being about lust, love, or even betrayal. The stakes were now comprised of my very soul, and I was utterly, irrevocably caught in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The day I married Emily felt surreal. As I stood at the altar, trying to suppress my nerves, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly off, but I brushed it aside as simple first-time jitters. Everyone looked so happy, relatives smiling and my best friends snapping pictures, but then came her vows, and that's when I knew I had stepped into something dark. The ceremony was beautiful until Emily took a breath and began, "I vow to cherish your heart in this life and the next, for as I have loved you in this world, I will seek your spirit in the shadows." A few guests shifted nervously, and I laughed it off, thinking it was a quirky metaphor for everlasting love, but when she continued, "And if the time comes when the stars align against us, I will seek the old ways to bind you to me, beyond the reach of fate," I recognized the unease in the air, the way my mother stiffened and my father exchanged a glance with the priest. As the ceremony went on, her eyes gleamed with a peculiar intensity, and her voice dipped into an almost hypnotic cadence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I should have been enchanted, or at least over the moon, but I didn't feel anything good, just a strangeness, like I was drowning in her words, a chill creeping along my spine. After the wedding, the reception seemed to reflect her strange vows. Emily was magnetic, drawing everyone in, making them feel connected to her. I told myself I was being paranoid, but then the toasts began, and my best man recounted how Emily had saved his life during a near-drowning incident last summer, going so far as to imply she had pulled him from death's grasp, a claim that had grown more mystical each time it was recounted. Her charm was infectious, yes, but whispers began circulating. I caught snippets of conversations in the corners of the room, cloaked in polite laughter, whining that Emily was just a little off. I brushed it away again, trying to keep the joy of our union alive, but as the weeks passed, her strange vows clouded my thoughts. Emily started coming home late, frequently murmuring under her breath as if entranced, and sometimes I'd find her standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her hair for hours without moving, her lips curling into a smile that felt wrong. One night, I awoke to a series of muffled cries coming from the backyard. Shivers ran through me as I crept downstairs, peering through the curtain to find Emily standing in a circle of candles, hands raised to the sky, the moonlight bathing her in a celestial glow. Shadows flickered around her as she softly chanted words that sent ice sweeping through my veins, twisting the air with a palpable tension that felt alive, and then just as suddenly, she dropped to her knees, breaking the spell. The moment shattered as she came inside, eyes vacant yet somehow aware, and I pretended to be asleep, hoping that my quiet dread was ill-founded. Days turned into weeks, and I found fragments of her ritual objects, dried herbs and strange symbols carved into discarded napkins and bits of paper, growing more concerned with every discovery but still hesitant to confront her, fearing what I might unleash. My waking nightmare unfurled when Emily's demeanor shifted. She sat at the dining table, eyes locked on something invisible, a sly smile creeping across her face. When she finally spoke, it sent a shudder racing through me. "You'll never believe what I can do now," she said, her eyes glinting with a feral excitement that was unsettling. "I found a way to ensure our love lasts forever, the way it was intended." I couldn't help but blurt out, "What do you mean?" My heart raced as rage twisted my gut. I didn't know what she'd been up to, but the desperation in her voice echoed something unholy. "We can bind our souls together," she exclaimed, and suddenly, I understood why everyone had seemed uneasy at our wedding. Beneath her beauty, she wove a darkness that could ensnare. I demanded answers that night, tracking her for hours across town, following clues that led to an old, decrepit bookstore on the outskirts, a storefront hidden in shadows, the very place she likely found the grim knowledge fuming from the pages. Inside, dust hung in the air, and walls lined with pervasive darkness teased lurid secrets, but as a bell tinkled, the shopkeeper turned slowly towards me, eyes gleaming like embers. I addressed him, spilling the truth of my fretting concerns, and to my horror, he grimaced and asked me the very question that ignited all the terror within me. "Did she tell you what this entails?" A sense of horror washed over me, an unbearable weight as he gestured to a scarred grimoire that shone eerily on the countertop. I recoiled, backpedaling into the night as I grasped the realization that my life was teetering on her needle's edge. She was drawn deep into something sinister and ancient, and I was ensnared, unable to escape the grip of her vows. I didn't sleep that night, and nightmares clawed at the edges of my consciousness, a twisted amalgamation of Emily's voice whispering through darkness, beckoning me to join her, promising eternity together, but at what cost? I watched as her footsteps became eerily melodic, almost like a chant calling to those that might hear her, and when dawn broke, I confronted her, desperation pouring from my voice as I demanded what incantation she'd invoked to bind me, and for a moment, I swayed in disbelief as she looked at me, genuinely puzzled. "Don't you want to become one?" she asked, and I realized in that moment, the gravity of her vow had ensnared me, her love tainted by an ulterior design to ensure I would never leave her, not in this life or the next, together eternally, but eternally transfixed in a tether from which there was no escape. In a last, futile act of bravery, I fled, packed what little I could in the blink of an eye, hoping against hope to break whatever invisible bind tethered my fate to this woman who no longer felt like my wife. But as I sped away, tears streaming from my eyes, the earth trembled beneath me, and the feeling of being watched settled thickly in the air. Months later, I still don't know who I am anymore or what reality I slipped away from, but Emily's vows echo in the crevices of my mind. I still hear whispers in the wind and catch glimpses of her shadow watching me from the corners of the streets at night, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting patiently for the stars to align once more. And I know the darkness I tried to shed might never let me go. I stopped in a small town while making a delivery, my truck laden with boxes of goods, the kind nobody notices until they run out, bottled water, canned food, cleaning supplies, and as I rolled into the heart of Maplewood, I felt an unsettling chill wash over me, though the sun hung high in the sky. The streets were unusually quiet, but the thick, heavy air hinted at untold stories lurking beneath the surface. I had already been on the road for hours when my stomach grumbled, and before I could think it through, I saw a diner, old and fading like the memories carried in its wooden beams. I figured I'd stretch my legs while grabbing a bite to eat, but as soon as I walked in, the atmosphere shifted. The few patrons inside stopped their conversations, turning their gazes towards me, eyes sharp and curious like wolves assessing a newcomer. I tried to shake it off, telling myself they were just friendly townsfolk, but when the waitress, a stocky woman with a crooked smile, slid a piece of pie in front of me, I noticed there was a layer of compound apprehension hanging in the air, and as I bit into that pie, sweet yet oddly pungent, I could feel their eyes rippling across my skin, fueling an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia. I tried to engage them in safe small talk, sticking to topics about the weather and sports, but they seemed eager to share their local lore, their folk tales that made my stomach churn. They spoke of shadows that moved independently from their owners, of the well at the edge of town that whispered names back when you called, and of the strange harvest festival where no one's crops ever seemed to flourish unless attributed to the dark figure they called the Whispering Man. I laughed at first, brushing off their stories as quaint community fabric, but when their expressions turned serious, genuine fear etched into their wrinkled faces, I started feeling the weight of their words, as if I were standing on the precipice of something I shouldn't take lightly. I found myself nodding along, swept into their tales, only able to work up half-hearted chuckles, and as I asked more about the Whispering Man, a tense silence fell, thickening the air like a storm. "He chooses," the waitress said, thumbing a rag against the counter. A shiver chased up my spine at her grave tone. "If you're lucky, it's just a bad crop. If you're not, it means his eyes are on you." That cronky old diner felt more like a witch's den than a welcoming place to eat, and for the first time that day, I regretted stopping. The continued tales spiraled down a dark alley of dread, revealing accounts of people who disappeared into the woods, lured by the promise of riches or the mesmerizing sound of laughter, a cruel, sweet melody that echoed through the trees. Their eyes flicked to the window at the woods beyond, their collective dread palpable, as they leaned closer to me, urging me to leave town before dark swallowed it whole. I laughed again, but this time it felt brittle as the waitress's smile faded, replaced by something more sinister. "You don't want to be out there at night," she said, referring to the woods which lay just beyond the diner, "because that's when he walks." I nodded, forcing a smile as I left a tip that felt painfully inadequate. As I got back into my truck, unease knotted in my stomach, blending with disbelief. Still, as I drove past the charming antique shops decorated for the Harvest Festival, my eyes lingered too long on a nearby grove. The trees twisted and gnarled, leaving me cold. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the pavement like long, grasping fingers, so I punched the accelerator to get out of Maplewood, but as the sky melted into twilight, the darkness drew stories around me, each tale echoing louder with each passing mile. The radio, strained and crackling with static, suddenly broke into a hauntingly familiar laughter, twisting through the air like fog, and I gripped the wheel, my palms sweaty. With my heart racing, I turned the volume down, but the laughter grew, wrapping around my mind until I could feel its icy touch. It mocked me, painted my fears with the brush of their stories, and when I glanced into the rearview mirror, the diner's fluorescent lights faded behind me, yet shadows danced just beyond my peripheral vision, flitting between trees. Panic clawed at my throat, and I pressed onward, but every mile felt heavier, the whispers creeping up alongside the truck, haunting my thoughts, reminding me of what I had unwittingly invited into my life by merely lingering too long to listen. The twisting curves of the road began to blur, morphing into the woods, and with each turn, I noticed the shapes from the trees forming into silhouetted figures, eyes glimmering like lanterns in the gloom, calling my name in voices that stung my ears like broken glass. All those folk tales I had cast aside became tangibly entwined with every beat of my heart. My foot slammed down on the gas, but my mind was racing faster than I could escape. The laughter morphed into cries that beckoned me to turn around, but when I did, there was nothing but the oppressive weight of smothering twilight pressing against the glass. I knew then that something had tethered itself to me, drawn from their stories, a dark entity that wouldn't let go. Heart pounding like a wild thing, I hit the brakes, skidding into a darkened clearing, desperate to gather myself, but the echo of the town's haunting legends rang louder, filling the silence like an insatiable presence. It was then I understood, the town, and its tales were not just idle gossip, they were warnings. Clutching my steering wheel, I could feel the heat of their eyes tracing my every move from the shadows, and as I watched the forest close in around me, I realized I was never meant to leave Maplewood. I was merely another story waiting to be added to theirs, the latest chapter in a long, twisted saga that should have remained buried in the folklore of a town I should have never entered. It started as a harmless TikTok trend, a harmless little competition called the Face Challenge where participants would mimic an emotional expression for a few seconds, hoping to go viral for their exaggerated or authentic portrayals of sadness, joy, and fear, something that felt harmless and amusing at first as we watched countless strangers and friends join in, but I should have seen the signs when my wife, Emily, a once sweet and cheerful artist, became obsessed with it all to the point of transforming our living room into a makeshift studio, walls lined with lighting equipment, a ring light perched like a watchful eye, and her phone set up on a tripod. But at first, I brushed off her obsession as just another phase, convincing myself that the frantic excitement of followers and likes was just a temporary whirlwind that she'd eventually outgrow. So when she began spending hours perfecting each expression, rehearsing in front of the mirror, her face contorting into grotesque masks of emotion, I thought it was just a quirky new hobby, until she started to lose track of time, my gentle reminders failing to pierce the bubble of her newfound fame, which I thought would burst at any moment, but instead, it grew more volatile. She announced she was going to try and combine the challenge with her artistic skills, live streaming her transformation into living canvases that brought emotional imagery to life, and while I admired her creativity, the process started to feel venomous, the long hours bleeding into nights while I lay awake next to her, the blue light from her phone casting eerie shadows on the walls, distorting my perception of time, and each morning I'd wake to find her more consumed, staring blankly at her phone as if it were the very fabric of reality and her latest video game traction, reaching thousands. Our dinner conversations faded into brief exchanges about her views, her likes, her comments, until one evening, she casually mentioned a concept called the dark face, a new twist on the challenge that supposedly involved drawing out raw, intense emotions, fear, pain, dread, until it manifested physically, and I tried to laugh it off, yet I felt unease prickling my skin. What did it mean to pull emotion out like that? But her eyes lit up as she spoke about it, her enthusiasm electric, buzzing with a fervor that reminded me of her brighter days, though I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something sinister lurking beneath her excitement, especially when she began locking herself in the studio, the hours stretching into deafening silence, and I started to hear whispers in the dead of the night, soft but insistent, her voice mingling with another, a darker timbre that sent chills racing down my spine, crashing through the tranquility until sleep eluded me, and one night, I broke down the door, heart racing as I pushed the flimsy wood, finding her, eyes wide and glistening with tears, face smeared with dark paint, attempting to mimic the look of agony, and she turned to me, her expression shifting from terror to ecstasy, and in that moment, I understood that she wasn't merely acting anymore, she was losing herself to the very emotions she channeled, each session blurring the lines between performance and reality. And with every upload, her followers cheered, demanded more, urging her to go deeper, to dive into the unexplored depths of despair. It was intoxicating for her. I wanted to scream at her to stop, to come back to the world with me, but my plea fell silent against the clamor of likes and comments, escalating to a point where her face became a canvas of horror painted with raw feelings, and I noticed an unsettling shift in her demeanor. Gasping breaths echoing in the bathroom one night after another failed submission that altered her humanity in a way I had never anticipated, her laughter twisting into something unrecognizable, sadistic yet euphoric, and in the days that followed, things felt increasingly wrong, unease permeating our home, the air growing thick with dread, and when I pushed her once to talk, to pull her back into reality, she erupted, shrieking, "You don't understand. I need to feel it, I need to show them." And that's when I finally saw the truth. The trend consumed her like a dark fire, feeding off her spirit, morphing her into something sinister, and the line blurred completely when she told me she wanted to attempt an extreme version of the dark face where she'd invite strangers into our home for a live session, each expressing their deepest sorrow as if it were a twisted therapy session, and I begged her to reconsider, frantically trying to reason with her, but nothing could penetrate the wall she erected, the increasing tension ripping us apart until the fateful night came. The living room filled with cold shadows of the unfamiliar faces that lined the walls, watching her as she sat in a chair draped in darkness, and as she performed, the air became thick with an overwhelming sense of loss and despair, her expressions contorting beyond anything human as people wept and gasped, completely captivated by her transformation, and at that moment, I felt the world slip away, a choking haze of despair flooding our home, as I stood frozen, realizing too late that something was profoundly wrong. The boundary of her spirit dissolving into those collected emotions, spiraling into an abyss of chaos until I saw her eyes gloss over, vacant and empty, completely engulfed by the hate, sorrow, and unrelenting pain looming all around. Then that insatiable urge to push the darkest emotions out just a little more consumed her, each thrumming heartbeat echoing along with a strange rhythmic chant resonating from the crowd until it all stopped. Silence engulfed the room. Emily slumped forward, her face devoid of life, a frozen mask of deep anguish. I rushed forward yelling her name, but the audience erupted in wild applause, dead-eyed and shameless, as if they had witnessed the most poetic performance. But this was real, it was horrific. Emily was gone, what was left was an empty shell, and I staggered back as a ripple of pain ran through every part of my body, clutching her limp hands, realizing in that moment that the trend cost me more than I could ever repay, a reality slipping through the cracks as I became painfully aware that Emily had not just slipped away, she had become one with the very emotions she immortalized, trapped forever in a torment I could never escape, while the crowd of followers chanted for more, 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 their hungry eyes glaring with obsession, fueling a darkness that they could never possibly understand, and as the lights dimmed forever on her presence, I could do nothing but scream into the void, a shocking testament to the price of viral fame, the unfathomable shadows lurking at the edges of our world that could devour anyone foolish enough to seek it. For months, the shadows of my life had twisted into something grotesque, a dark tapestry woven with the hides of my victims, the lives I'd mercilessly taken in desperate acts of survival. I didn't start out wanting to kill. It was just a byproduct of my crumbling existence after the economy collapsed and food became a precious commodity. Each life I extinguished weighed heavily on me, but necessity dulls the edge of remorse, or so I told myself, until the weight became unbearable. The thrill had morphed into an insidious burden. During the day, I saw their faces, the glimmer of fear in their eyes as I approached, and at night, I could hear their whispers in the silence of my bedroom. I could feel the paranoia creeping in, tightening its grip on my throat, and even though I wore a mask of normalcy when I kissed my wife each evening, I knew she sensed the shift, my distant gaze, the sweat that beaded on my forehead in the dead of night as I lay awake, counting my guilty breaths. My once vibrant world was now a monochrome blur, and to combat the unraveling of my soul, I decided to involve her, thinking perhaps that a shared darkness could soften the edges of my own. "It's a survival thing," I told her, my voice steady despite the tumult roaring within. I needed her help because I was losing control, and I didn't want to admit that the line between right and wrong had become irreparably smudged in my mind. My wife, Rebecca, was not a killer. She was light and laughter wrapped in soft tangles of hair and warm eyes that knew the world as a kind place. I coaxed her into the shadows by exposing her to the grim reality I'd created and showing her the desperation wrapped around our throats, binding us to this lifelike chains of rusted metal. I didn't prepare her for the blood or the horror. I only hinted at the danger lurking in our world. "You want to protect our future, don't you?" I asked, my heart racing as she looked into my eyes, something dangerous flickering behind her gentle disposition. The transformation was gradual. She started to understand my paranoia, began to mimic my anger, and it wasn't long before her eyes hardened too. I saw it in the way she clutched the kitchen knife, fingers tracing its sharp edge, and how she relished the idea of taking action rather than being a passive participant in a world bent on consuming us. We began to stalk our prey together, slowly descending into the murky depths of something we didn't fully comprehend. My hand trembling as I held my wife's when she squeezed the trigger of our first shared victim, a man who had once recklessly bragged about hoarding food supplies. It was dark, so dark, and as I held her quaking body afterward, the buzz of exhilaration mingled with a newfound fear. The first taste had awakened something fierce, inflating our lungs with adrenaline and muffling the screaming guilt that had plagued me. Yet, what I hadn't anticipated was how this new involvement would twist her, rather than alleviating my toll, it would deepen it, spreading thick like a virus through our home as we turned from survivors into something more monstrous. Her laughter, once bright, began to echo oddly in the quiet rooms, and the sparkle in her eyes held a more predatory glow with each life we took part in snuffing out. Our arguments morphed. We fought about the simplest things and then exploded into rage and shouting as I tried to hold her back from seeking out more targets, leading this dark odyssey to numbing and unrecognizable places. I realized too late that I had become a puppet in my own experiment, unaware that she had grown stronger behind the strings I thought I controlled. It was the late-night phone calls that broke me, conversations with people who had been close to the ones we took, whispers full of suspicion and grief creeping into our lives like the darkness I thought I had embraced. Then one night, I returned home, breathless and cold with dread, the stench of awful decisions hanging over me, only to find her standing in the middle of our dimly lit kitchen, her eyes wide and frenzied, cradling a new bloody blade in one hand and a letter in the other, a note from the family of a man we had gruesomely taken, addressed explicitly to Rebecca, begging for her to reveal who had stolen their brother. Everything I had done in secret now bore its ugly face back at me, contorted with anger and accusation. Rebecca broke down in sobs, but this was not the gentle rain of sadness I expected. It sounded like triumph, her laughter slicing through the air like a blade. I was terrified of what I had unleashed, the consequences of my hubris. We became entangled in a tapestry of betrayal and blood, now haunted, living in the shadows we once commanded, forsaking the lifeline of our love for a newly formed abyss of terror and despair. She no longer spoke freely, her language became riddled with lies, and every time the door creaked, every time the phone rang, I spied horror hiding behind every corner. The night it all came crashing down, the walls of our reality dissolved in a symphony of chaos. Strangers came calling, armed with vengeance, seeking the truth that lay entangled in her hands and my dark legacy. The fleeting moments of light and joy were now eclipsed by paranoia shadowing everything, and I realized far too late that I never taught her how to embrace darkness but rather how to thrive in it, leaving us standing amidst the ruins of our shattered lives, bound together by the very nightmares we had created and shared. The faces of those we hunted became haunting memories plastered to the inside of my eyelids, and as blood stained the insides of our home, once a sanctuary, now a citadel of guilt, the ironic laughter of my wife echoed off the walls, the haunting realization dawning upon me: we were no longer the hunters, we were the hunted, a chilling reflection of the darkness I thought I had shared, now ebbing away into something I could never escape. In our desperate yearning to protect one another, we had crafted a nightmare without end, weaving our fates together with threads of blood and despair, eternally trapped in a cycle of violence that now thrived on our very souls. My mother told me I was the lucky one, and even now, her voice lingers in my mind, a haunting melody of both reassurance and dread, echoing through the cavernous silence left in her absence. She had smiled when she said it, her eyes shimmering with a blend of pride and something darker, something I was too young to comprehend at the time. I thought she was talking about the little things, like my natural talent for art that had led me to win contests in school, or the way I could get along with anyone I met. I remember feeling special under her gaze, as if fate had somehow smiled upon me. But now that she's gone, that phrase haunts me like a ghost, an unsolved riddle lurking just under the surface of my thoughts, and I find myself combing through my memories for answers. The night of her funeral, I slipped into her room, a space still redolent with her perfume, and discovered a small, intricately carved box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It felt too fragile for the weight it carried, and inside, I found a series of photographs, black and white images that sent chills racing down my spine. Each one depicted a different child from our neighborhood, all of them beaming with joy, unblemished by the world, but there was something about the way their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes, a flicker of something sinister in their gaze. I flipped through them, the gnawing unease growing heavier, until a loose photo slipped from my grasp, an image of a girl with wild curls and a wicked grin, unrecognizable to me but for one detail: she wore the same locket I had on my dresser, the one my mother had given me as a keepsake. It was then that a cold realization washed over me: this girl had vanished years ago, her disappearance a dark cloud over our community that somehow became mere whispers in the background of our lives. Frantically, I turned the box upside down, surprised when a folded note fell out. My fingers shook as I unfolded the paper, the cursive handwriting immediately recognizable as my mother's, and each word felt like a dagger driving deeper into my flesh. "You are the lucky one, my sweet, but you must never let them see you." Confusion spiraled into fear. Who are they? And who was I, really? I delved into the stories surrounding the children from the photographs, piecing together a chilling narrative that connected them all. Each had been reported missing, each connected to the enveloping darkness that pooled in the edges of our town like a predator lurking in the underbrush. Days blurred into nights as I haunted the local library and scoured online archives, a ravenous need for the truth clawing at my insides. My mother had been a part of something beneath the surface of our daily lives, something that people didn't talk about, something that encouraged silence in the face of terror. I stumbled upon whisperings of a cult, one that worshipped some ancient entity that fed off the essence of children, luring them in with false promises of safety and illumination. Nothing seemed concrete, but the threads kept pulling taut, leading me to the crumbling foundation of an abandoned church on the outskirts of town, where the air weighed heavy with the scent of rotting wood and despair. As I approached, I felt an electric charge rise in the air, a warning I couldn't quite understand, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the door adorned with strange symbols carved deep into the wood. I stepped inside, the oppressive darkness wrapping around me like a shroud, and there, in the center of the shattered sanctuary, was a circle of flickering candles casting airy shadows against the decaying walls. My heart raced as I realized that the photographs from the box were strewn about the floor, faces twisted in expressions of terror, the same children whose stories had made headlines for weeks before being tucked away like old receipts. And then I heard it, the faint melody of children's laughter echoing off the walls, a sound that will haunt me until my last breath. I turned to flee, but something stopped me cold. Standing in the shadows at the edge of the room was a figure cloaked in a heavy black garment, the hood drawn low over their face. "You shouldn't have come here, little girl," the figure sighed, each word drenched in malice, and in that moment, I knew I had intruded upon something wicked, a void that consumed every flicker of innocence. I wanted to scream, but my voice had dried up like the petals of a long-dead flower, and instinct kicked in, the heavy thrum of survival urging me to run. I darted toward the door, but the figure moved with fluid grace, blocking my path effortlessly, their voice a taunting whisper that curled into my ear. "You were the lucky one." She had to make a choice. Choice? In that instant, the veil lifted, and I saw clear as day the truth of my mother's words. She had chosen me over them, sacrificing some hidden gift to ensure I lived, that I was the last to go. But lucky or cursed, the truth bore down on me like a weight too heavy to comprehend. I was tethered to the horrors of my childhood, to the darkness that had swallowed those children whole. As the candles flickered louder, shadows danced, and a blood-curdling wail echoed through the room, it became crystal clear. My mother had tried to protect me from what she knew, but in her silence had handed me a fate worse than death. In the end, the question lingered: was I truly the lucky one, or merely the last child standing at the edge of an abyss, one small breeze away from being swept away like the others? I rushed out into the night, heart pounding with every step, a raw scream bubbling in my throat, the stars bearing silent witness to a truth I could no longer run from. The legacy of the lucky one could consume me like it had consumed them, and as I glanced back, the figure stood there, watching, waiting, a promise woven into the shadows, making it clear that this was far from over. My sister is an anomaly, and I've never known how to tell anyone without sounding insane, but here we go. Ever since we were kids, Clara was different. She wasn't like the other children. While they poured their energy into games and wild imaginations, Clara preferred sitting alone, flipping through pages of thick, dusty books and sketching strange symbols that felt like they were plucked from the darkest corners of the universe. It started when she turned 10, that's when she first locked eyes with me and whispered that she could see colors in the air, vibrant shades swirling and dancing, painting the walls of our dreary room with vivid hues that only she seemed to perceive. I dismissed it as childhood eccentricity until one fateful night when our parents had gone to bed, and I was meant to stifle my growing anxiety over failing grades by pretending to sleep. Instead, I ended up in the hallway, driven by an unshakable urge to check on Clara. As I neared her room, I stopped dead in my tracks as the door gently creaked open. The air felt charged, pulsing with an energy I had never sensed before. I'll never forget the sight that greeted me: Clara levitating several inches off the bed, her hair cascading around her head as though it were underwater. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved in a hushed chant that sounded like gibberish, yet reverberated deeply in my bones. Terrified, I stumbled back, knocking over an old box filled with forgotten toys and writing implements. The moment Clara heard it, her eyes flew open, and everything went still. The vibrant colors she spoke of faded, as though someone had flipped a switch. She sat up abruptly, looking at me with such raw intensity that I almost felt like I could drown in it. Clara smiled, a thin line of satisfaction stretching across her face, and I remember feeling like prey before a predator, nothing but a bewildered observer. I bolted to my room, convinced that I'd made it all up in my head, but sleep remained a distant dream as Clara concocted ever more strange activities during the days that followed. She made the odd request to go outside at odd hours and would insist I join her as we lay in the grass under the stars, while she would talk to them, her eyes sparkling with a peculiar intensity that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I laughed it off, attributing it to a vivid imagination, but then came that summer when I began to notice she had become a magnet for bizarre occurrences. Neighbors' pets went missing, faint screams echoed from her window at night, yet whenever I asked about it, she'd simply smile wider, the same predator with prey look, and say, "It's only the stars, dear brother." It became increasingly disconcerting as I witnessed the oddity escalate. One evening, I stood in the shadows while Clara played with her new friends, a circle of boys and girls who appeared out of nowhere, all equally peculiar and impossibly perfect looking. Their laughter chimed through the air as if they were tethered to a cosmic rhythm only Clara could hear. Every time I tried to engage them, they'd give me vacant smiles, their eyes glistening like they belonged to something that no longer lived on this planet. I wanted to scream, wanted to pull Clara from their grips, but instead, I took a step back, letting fear meld with the coldness creeping into my bones. It felt as though they were dancing on the precipice of something grotesque, luring her away from everything that felt human. I began warning her about them, trying to pull her back from the strange crowd, but Clara would only giggle, her laughter like particles brushing my skin, before turning her gaze skyward, shimmering with a knowing glisten. When she told me about the night she could fly, I thought it'd be the last string that broke the sanity in my head. She recounted feelings of weightlessness, shared secrets with the moon, as if it were an old friend. Desperate, I confronted her, pleading for my sister to return, but the only response was that predatory smile, that secret she never wanted to share. I started doubting my own sanity, watching helplessly as a shadow unfurled in her presence, devoured the warmth of the once cheery home we'd known, and replaced it with an eerie hum that matched the disquieting pulse of her laughter. I wish I'd heeded the signs. Shortly after, it happened. One quiet evening, I returned from school to an unusually still house, the air charged with tension, and Clara's door was ajar, a deep longing tugging at my heart. I ventured inside. There, I found nothing but suffocating silence. Forcing myself to take a step forward, I saw the shadows on her walls twist unnaturally, whispering secrets only an old soul could understand. In a panic, I raced to her closet and nearly collapsed when I discovered the hidden door behind her clothes. It creaked open to a narrow passageway that felt like the throat of some unspeakable entity. The resonance of laughter echoed around me, that ghastly sound I had grown to dread, yet drawn in. I pressed forward, compelled to find her. I followed the chilling sounds through the dark, down what felt like an eternal descent, my heart hammering in my chest. As I turned a corner, light blazed through an archway, and my instincts screamed for me to turn back, but curiosity propelled my steps forward. But then I saw it, a massive chamber, filled with children like Clara, their faces obscured, all cloaked in swirling lights, connected by threads of shimmering energy floating above their heads. At the center, Clara danced among them like a goddess, her radiance eclipsing everything around her, yet in her eyes was a void that consumed any trace of the sister I once knew. She turned, eyes meeting mine, and in a heartbeat, that warmth of familiarity turned into an impossible hollowing. "You found me," she said, that predatory smile stretching wider than I could bear, and with a flick of her wrist, the chamber erupted in a tide of shadows, sweeping toward me like an avalanche. I stumbled back, grappling for a grip on reality, and that's when the laughter surged, that terrible, otherworldly laughter that vibrated through my bones as the shadows enveloped my vision. I found myself pulled into the miasma of swirling darkness, each breath igniting an urgent sense of dread. As they closed in, Claire's voice resonated through the chaos, pure and chilling like a bell tolling at midnight. "You'll understand soon enough, dear brother. The stars never leave us, they only take what's theirs." Then, the world started collapsing around me. I clawed against the void, but the more I fought, the more it pressed against me, tilting my very essence down into an infinite spiral as Clara's form faded from view. And now, as I sit here, typing away this warning in the depths of my constricting solitude, I can't help but think that my sister is more than an anomaly. She's a bridge, a beacon, or perhaps even a herald for something ancient and unspeakable, creeping ever closer in the shadows. So, if you ever come across someone claiming to see colors in the air or hear the laughter of distant stars, run. Run before they turn their gaze towards you and take your warmth away, reclaiming what was always theirs. I'm a phlebotomist at a rural hospital, and I always thought the best part of my job was the connection I formed with my patients. Their stories usually distracted me from the monotony of drawing blood, but nothing could prepare me for the day I met Mr. Hargrove. He came in with a peculiar request, a routine panel to check on his blood, but the way his eyes darted around the room made me uneasy. He was a thin man, perhaps in his 70s, with skin that seemed too tight over his bones, giving him a skeletal appearance. As I prepped my supplies, I noticed the deep shadows under his eyes and an unsettling brightness to his irises, like he was hiding something behind a veneer of normalcy. I brushed it off. After all, I'd seen my fair share of frail patients, but when I slid the needle into his vein, I felt an unexpected resistance, as if his blood were reluctant to flow. It wasn't just the struggle in my hand, there was something in his gaze, an urgent plea as if he were trying to warn me. The blood that filled the vial was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. It shimmered in a way that made me think of oil on water, all dark and swirling, and a sense of dread washed over me when I observed it cloaked in shifting patterns that seemed almost alive. I redirected my thoughts into small talk, asking him about his family, But he only chuckled nervously and said they were better off away from this old bag of bones. That chilled me. I finished the draw and sent the blood off to the lab, but I couldn't shake the feeling of something being very wrong. The tests took longer than expected, an hour rolling into 2, stretching my anxiety to its breaking point, and when the lab finally sent over the results, my skin prickled with a mix of relief and horror. The panel showed elevated levels of toxins and bizarre markers I'd never studied, numbers that pointed toward something biologically impossible for a living person. Pushing aside my fear, I decided to confer with Dr. Kessler, the physician in charge, who scrutinized the results with the same expression I wore, uncertainty mixed with disbelief. "These can't be right," he muttered, shaking his head as if that would shake the unsettling truth from the page. "This man is fine, I examined him just yesterday." "You did a second test, right?" That's when the panic set in, each second of silence vibrating with the implications of what this could mean. But before I could explain, there was no second test, only the peculiar first one. Hargrove's voice broke through the atmosphere as he came teetering into the room, his body wheeling like a ghostly shadow, almost ethereal in his frailty, but this time there was something new. Black veined streaks slithered across his pallid skin like roots in search of sunlight. "I have to go," he rasped, panic etching every syllable. The urgency in his voice sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Something wasn't right. Rachel didn't be able to release him without clarifying the bizarre results, but he was already sinking into a new realm of desperate resolve. "No, you don't understand." He stumbled backward and nearly collapsed, grabbing the door frame, his gaunt fingers digging into the wood. "Get away from me. It's already here." The room chilled, and for a moment, it felt as if the air lay heavy with the weight of his revelation. I tried to step forward, to calm him, but the moment I moved, he darted out of the room, bolting down the hallway like a hunted animal. I chased after him, calling for help, anxiety tightening around my chest as I watched him weave through the hospital, a jagged silhouette against fluorescent lights, until he reached the exit, screeching to a halt before the outer doors. He turned to me, eyes wild. "You don't understand. They're waiting for me outside." Suddenly, he recoiled, gripping his head as if it throbbed with the weight of some hidden truth, and when he fell to his knees, fists slamming against the ground, his blood seeped through the thin fabric of his pants, black, bubbling, like ink spilling onto paper. I froze, stomach turning as understanding dawned. This man was fighting something far more horrific than I could comprehend. He suddenly looked at me with clarity amidst the chaos, the depths of his fear radiating in waves, whispering, "You have to help me." His breath grew ragged as those faint black veins began to pulse, a grotesque rhythm, and I felt myself teetering on the brink of his revelations. I reached for my phone to call for security as he wailed, "It's too late. They know," and just like that, the lights flickered, and shadows seemed to thicken, the hallway warping around us as though the building itself was listening. I stood frozen, paralyzed by dread, as from the corner of my eye I noticed figures lurking just outside, shapes obscured by the darkness, their shapes defined by twisted flesh and unnatural angles. When the security guards finally arrived, they rushed Hargrove away, muttering under their breath about getting him stabilized, but I knew that wasn't possible. An hour later, the commotion settled, and the whispers of what had transpired spilled through the break room. All I could think was that his blood was no longer just blood, it had become something else entirely. Over the next few days, rumors flared about Hargrove, how he'd vanished after a brief transfer, but each hushed conversation bore the same conclusion: something had come for him, something that preyed upon the weakness of the living. I kept waiting for the call that never came, a finality to this malignant mystery, and when it did, I was too late. A week later, I clocked in only to find the hospital eerily quiet, the customary beeps of machines replaced by a ghostly silence. As I stumbled upon Dr. Kessler in the break room, staring pallid and shaken, the lab results scattered on the table like damning evidence. "They've lost track of him," he said, voice trembling, "but the blood samples are still watching us. You felt it, didn't you?" Warning spiked my spine, dread crawling through my veins. I wasn't mistaken. I had seen the darkness in his blood, felt the tremors of its lingering effects, and I knew now, as a shiver tracked my spine, that Hargrove was no longer dead, but transformed, becoming something mighty and terrible. And in that moment, with the hospital feeling like a living entity holding its breath, I understood that whatever waited outside, monitoring our every move, was coming for me next. As I stood clasping the edge of the countertop, I couldn't help but think that in embracing the pulse of life, I'd inadvertently uncovered a far more sinister world, one that offered no solace, no escape, only the haunting knowledge that the blood we draw may sometimes harbor more than just sickness. It can carry whispers of the abyss, memorials of unspeakable things waiting silently in the dark, tethering us all to a fate we can't outrun. And I felt it crawling closer, felt the shadows encircling as I realized I might have drawn the line between the living and the monstrous, allowing something unholy to seep through, leaving me standing on the precipice of my own chaos, left to question exactly what it was I had become. We'd been looking forward to hitting the new water park that had opened just a few towns over. It was the biggest one we'd ever seen, boasting vertical drop slides that plummeted into pools of vibrant turquoise water and a lazy river that twisted like a snake through an elaborate, jungle-themed setting. My wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids, Mia and Jake, couldn't contain their excitement as we drove there on that sunny Saturday morning, the air filled with laughter and the sound of countless other families embarking on the same adventure. As we arrived, the park loomed above us like a behemoth, its towering slides casting daunting shadows over the parking lot. We passed through the entrance, greeted by the scent of sunscreen and the far-off sounds of joyful screams mingled with the splashes of water. The first few hours were pure magic. We laughed as we careened down slides, Mia's shrieks of delight echoing in my ears as she challenged me to races while Jake splashed people from the safety of the kiddie pool. We all enjoyed giant pretzels and slushy drinks, the sun warming our skin while I idly wondered how long we could stay. I promised myself to keep track of the time, not wanting to lose the evening sun. As the afternoon drew to a close, we decided to tackle one last slide, the park's crown jewel, a colossal structure called the Abyss, towering over everything like a sentinel of thrill. It seemed harmless enough, a classic drop that shot you down into dark waters, yet as I climbed the slick, winding stairs, I felt a strange unease, as if I'd stepped into the mouth of a beast. My family and I were separated as we shuffled into the queue. Mia and Jake soon glanced at me from the line, their faces brimming with excitement, and despite the creeping anxiety in my stomach, I couldn't let them see my fear. As I finally reached the top, the lifeguard, a teen with a weary grin, gestured for me to sit on the inflatable mat. The view from up there was stunning yet disorienting. Below us, the chaos swirled like an intoxicating dream, and for a moment, I felt weightless, suspended between exhilaration and dread. I shot down the slide like a bullet, the world turning upside down as I spiraled into the dark, a scream escaping my lips, more of pure thrill than fear. The water rushed over me, engulfing me as if I were being swallowed whole, and just as I thought I'd reached the surface, I was pulled under by an unseen force, churning deeper and deeper until the light above faded. Panic gripped me, and I fought my way to the top, breaking through the surface gasping. The area was eerily quiet, the laughter and splashes had vanished, replaced by a heavy stillness. Confused, I looked for my family, but there were only strangers staring back at me, their expressions caught somewhere between fear and disbelief, as if they were spectators in a tragic performance. I stumbled to the edge of the pool and desperately searched the faces for Mia and Jake, but all I found were the panicked eyes of adults fleeing for safety. The lifeguard was looking around too, his gaze uncharacteristically solemn, as if he could sense something shifting in the fabric of reality. Something was wrong, everything felt off. We rushed toward the exit in a clamor, my heart pounding as wild thoughts spiraled through my mind. It wasn't until we reached the parking lot that I realized we were the last ones left. The park, which had been abuzz with life, was now a ghostly shell, devoid of laughter, rides, or the vibrant colors that had lured us here in the first place. The sun hung low, casting an eerie twilight over everything. The car felt like a lifeboat as we climbed in, flinging our wet towels into the back as panic set in. I turned the ignition, but the engine revved weakly, and a foreboding silence settled in the air. Beckoning looks from Mia and Jake sent a chill down my spine as I tried to shrug off what had happened. Maybe it was just a freak accident, a temporary glitch in our family day out. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it, the figure lurking at the edge of the parking lot in the shadows, its dark silhouette shifting unnaturally as if it were weaving in and out of reality. My heart raced. I couldn't tell whether it was a trick of the light or something far more sinister, but the moment the creature's eyes met mine, a freezing dread washed over me. I slammed the gas pedal, the tires screeching against the asphalt as we tore away from that nightmarish place. Home was supposed to be a haven, but as I lay in bed that night, the unsettling silence felt like a burden pressing down on my chest. I anxiously ran through my mind the events of the day, the laughter, the splashes, all of it tainted now, tainted by that thing. The night deepened, wrapping us in a cocoon of unease, and as I listened for the comfort of my children's small breaths, I felt an insistent pit in my stomach, whispering that this wasn't over. Days turned into weeks, and gradually the whimsical smiles on Mia and Jake's faces faded, replaced by a hollow gaze that made my heart clench. It was as if they carried a burden too heavy for their young hearts, the way they stared into space pondering something just beyond their understanding. The laughter we'd once shared turned into tense whispers. One night, I found them sitting in the dark, their backs to me, clutching each other tight. I approached cautiously, dread swirling within me as the closet door creaked open beside them, shadows dancing across the wall. "What are you two doing?" I asked, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. They turned slowly, their eyes wide with fear as they pointed at the darkness, murmuring something incomprehensible. A chill raced through me, I couldn't help but feel the darkness linger, gathering around us. Nights turned restless, I'd hear whispers in the air, snatches of familiar voices twisted and warped, echoing off the walls, inseparable from my children's soft whimpers. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but as the dark continued to stretch its grasp around our family, it became impossible to ignore. The unthinkable happened a few months later when I received a call from Sarah while I was at work. "Something's wrong with the kids, please come home." Her voice was shaky, frayed at the edges, and a cold wave of dread engulfed my body as I rushed home, every traffic light feeling like a slow-motion nightmare. I burst through the door to find Sarah kneeling beside Jake, his small frame shaking violently as he stared into the hallway, fear etched in his face while Mia gripped his arm, her own features filled with dread. "What's happening?" I asked, but tears streamed down Sarah's face. They were speaking in hushed tones, their whispers in unintelligible language, and I noticed then how their eyes glimmered unnaturally, almost as if they reflected the darkness that seemed to pulse around us. I imagined the abyss beneath the water, that dark despair I'd felt for a brief moment, clawing back, grabbing on, hazing the edges of reality. Everything grew darker, shadows seeming to spill out from the corners, wrapping tightly around us, and just as I was about to reach for them, a voice echoed, ancient and guttural, slipping through the cracks in reality, "They belong to the abyss." In a single, horrifying moment, I realized what I had unleashed, and as the darkness surged, as the shadows pulled me into their realm, I knew that the water park had ruined our lives, not just for us, but for everyone who ever dared to cross its threshold, caging us in a twisted reality that would never let go. It started innocently enough, a raised eyebrow at a friend's offbeat joke in the crowded cafeteria, the kind of thing that usually fades amidst the clatter of trays and laughter, but then it happened. David never came back to class after that day. I remember sitting in the back of the lecture hall and noticing his absence during our sociology discussion. A chilling proclamation of delayed concern appeared when word ripped through our campus. David was found in his dorm room, grinning ear to ear, lifeless but locked in that sickening expression, his features twisted as if he were blissfully unaware of everything that had happened. To say the news spread like wildfire is an understatement. It sent a wave of anxiety crashing over students, and whispers filled the air about smiling death syndrome, as a handful of communications majors dubbed it, the idea that the act of smiling had become a deadly contagion, pervading deeper than the usual gossip and unease of exams and dating. It was the week leading up to finals, and as classes dwindled, I began to witness the aftermath of panic, random smiles in hallways that turned into wide grins, students clutching their stomachs in laughter that morphed into hysterics. Someone else from our circle found 2 days later, also within their dorm, staring at nothing with that ghastly grin stretched across their lifeless face. Faculty scrambled to maintain order while sending out emails suggesting mental health resources, but they only added to the apprehension. Like desperate attempts to dam an unyielding flood, the air was thick with fear, and as night fell, students would huddle in crowded lounges, sharing stories, pooling information, trying to piece together what the hell was happening to us. Social media lit up with the hashtag #SmileSyndrome, countless posts requested to warn others, cautioning against the spread, but then there were those who laughed it off, adding their own warped humor, claiming it was just final stress manifesting as bizarre behavior, a coping mechanism that spiraled dangerously out of control until you could hear the echoes of laughter turning grim. I had an unsettling gut feeling about it all, especially after seeing Professor Lindholm, who had lectured us on psychological effects just a week prior, go quiet as he stood at the lectern, pupils dilated, trying to form words, only to dissolve into convulsive giggles that eventually turned into that horrifying smile. The rumor grew that those who smiled the most were the ones who passed first, and at the heart of it all was an unsettling presence we couldn't identify, until Josh, my roommate, roped me into researching online forums where commonalities connected victims, stress, fatigue, missed social cues, and then we discovered a pinned post with a chilling warning claiming that the first signs were profound and unpredictable euphoria, and by the time you'd realize, it was too late, your very spirit was drained while that smile remained trapped on your face, haunting you in death. I could feel myself spiraling into paranoia, avoiding eye contact, suppressing laughter, more careful about what I said in passing, avoiding jokes altogether, but each day felt heavier, as if something malevolent was lurking, preying on our collective anxiety, feeding off it, until the claustrophobia of isolation drove me deeper into desperation. The more we sought comfort in conversation, the more it seemed we were exchanging sorrows just laced with escalating dread. Every chuckle met with caution, laughter felt like a ticking bomb that would go off with another sinister smile haunting our minds, enveloping any topic that dared to surface. One night, unable to sleep, I crept into the common room to catch up on readings and found Josh staring blankly at the screen, mouth open into that eerie crescent of glee. I shook him, yelled his name until his eyes snapped to me, but the grin lingered too long, and I bolted to my room, locking the door, clutching my phone as I scrolled through frantic posts that painted more than just anxiety. They were warnings, desperate cries for help shrouded in a joking, eerily dark tone. I had to get out, so I made plans to leave campus for the weekend, when I bumped into Ellen, her face illuminated by her phone screen, eyes wide in disbelief announcing the latest victim, grinning and cold, and despite the seemingly light-hearted conversation, her voice trembled with disquiet, her demeanor wavering between terrified and ecstatic. Or was I losing my grip on reality? The doors of our university were never locked, a false sense of security that day swiftly dashed when I pulled the handle only to find it wouldn't budge. Darkness swallowed the night around me, and I rushed to the nearest exit, my heart racing, but what I found left no room for breathing. Trapped against the jagged edges of the vending machine sat a broken body, its inches between consciousness and death, admiring the fluorescent lights with nothing more than that sickening grin stretched across its face. Upon turning to escape, I stumbled into a frantic Ellen, who simply laughed, a sound soaked in hysteria. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she announced before throwing her arms wide as if to embrace it all, and then without missing a beat, she leaned in close, inches from my face, and whispered, "Don't you get it? This is freedom." My world spiraled, the laughter twisted into a cacophony echoing through the halls, drowned in inklings of insanity, laughter rising to a crescendo. I ran, heart pounding against my ribs, feet pounding against the floor as I found solace behind the locked door of my dorm room, looking out into the abyss that had taken over our campus, but fear, guilt, and something I couldn't name coiled viciously in my gut as the sounds of manic laughter grew louder, inching closer, mocking me with the insanity I thought I could escape, until I plummeted into a wave of darkness, sinking beneath the surface of smiles that would never fade. I was commissioned to write a horror story, which sounded like a dream job for an aspiring writer like me, until I received the bizarre guidelines from my client, a shadowy figure who insisted on being called the connoisseur. The first of these guidelines stated that I needed to include an original fear that hadn't been explored in fiction, which seemed impossible given the saturated market of horror literature. The second guideline required that my protagonist must experience the fear firsthand, while the third stipulation struck me as particularly chilling. Each element I wrote had to become real if someone read it aloud. Skeptical yet intrigued, I decided to take the plunge, spending nights sleepless, clawing at the creaky keyboard of my laptop, crafting a character named Martin, a reclusive librarian with an obsession for ancient survival manuals. As I wove his story, I invented the concept of fearborn, a state where an individual is hunted by their own fears manifested into physical threats, a concept I thought was original enough for the connoisseur. But with every word I typed, I sensed something was wrong. I began to experience vivid hallucinations involving surreal monsters emerging from the pages of my own drafts. The hardest part was acknowledging that my writing adequately mirrored Martin's growing paranoia as he meticulously catalogued tomes depicting nightmarish creatures, becoming convinced one of the books was trying to escape its bindings. It wasn't until late one night, exhaustion hanging heavily over me like a shroud, that I felt compelled to read aloud a particularly intense scene where Martin opened the forbidden book, and the atmosphere instantly warped as a scream echoed in my basement. I stopped, heart racing, feeling the wall, once solid, pulsate like something alive. The grotesque illustrations in that accursed book began to swirl in my mind, taunting me with images of mistrustful shadow figures, nightmarish beasts lurking in the corners, whispering my fears back to me. Days turned into eerie loops of fear and writing, and finally, I sent the connoisseur my completed draft, hoping against hope that it would end there. Yet, the next hour was spent peering over my shoulder, feeling watched. My phone buzzed seconds later, and the connoisseur had replied. They loved the story but insisted on an unlisted reading, a secretive form of sharing the tale with an exclusive group they belonged to. At the time, I was too naive to think twice about it, unable to fathom the gravity of tying my existence to that of my fictional creation. I complied with the whims of my dark patron, performing the reading via private livestream for a group of faceless avatars whose eyes flickered across the screen like candle flames in the dark. As I narrated the part where Martin confronted his personalized manifestation of despair, swirling shadow figures began appearing in the corners of the feed, moving in sync with my words in ways that seemed almost sentient. The viewers were mesmerized, leaning closer to their screens as I continued the tale, oblivious to the yawning abyss forming around me. I finally finished the reading, panting, eager to log off, yet as I ended the stream I realized my apartment had transformed. Shadows now writhed in my peripheral vision, faint whispers echoed through the hall as if the walls themselves had begun to breathe. The connoisseur's words echoed in my mind, haunting me, "Do not fear, embrace the fear." That night, I couldn't shake the sensation of being hunted. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps, my own breathing turned deafening, and when I glanced at the mirror, I could have sworn something stood behind me, shadowy and formless. As days stretched into weeks, my ties to the connoisseur deepened. They pressured me for more stories, desperate writings that held my soul captive on the drive to create. I unwittingly fed the terror that was rising within me. It was as if my manuscripts had grown fangs, each line sinking deeper into the essence of whatever had pushed its way through from the story I'd woven. The last straw came late one evening when I couldn't find Martin's story in my files, the emptiness gnawing at me, the sense of violation growing unbearable as I stared blankly at my screen. Panicking, I typed frantically searching. When a notification popped up, "Your story was reinvoked." My heart fell. I stumbled onto an online forum littered with praise and horrified testimonials from those who'd read my words aloud, recounting how the shadows had leapt off the page and into their lives, twisting their greatest fears into monstrous entities that tormented them. I was about to delete my account when a private message tinged with malice appeared. "You were warned, and now we are free." It was the connoisseur. The last shred of control I had fading away as chilling laughter echoed in my mind. I reached for my phone, ready to call for help, when there was a knock at the door. A desperate echo of fear pulled me toward it. When I opened it, there were no saviors, only shadows creeping in, slithering around my feet like hungry serpents. They knew my name and my fears, they'd become my fears. Every tall shadow looming, every forgotten scream came alive, feeding off my plight until I realized the dread of being fearborn was no longer fiction. I had invited it in, and now, it was too late for anyone, including me. Now, as I sit here in the gathering dark, I can't help but wonder who among you might carry pieces of my story that are waiting for their own rebirth. Do you remember how many children you had before the fog? I found myself asking that question as I wandered through the empty streets of my once vibrant neighborhood, now cloaked in a thick gray mist that clung to everything like a shroud, swallowing even the faintest light. It wasn't always like this. I could still recall the laughter of children echoing across the once busy playgrounds, the ice cream truck jingling merrily as it rounded the corner while their tiny hands reached excitedly for cones that dripped with melting sweetness. But then the fog rolled in, just one evening, without warning. It descended on the town like a predator, suffocating the warmth and slinging an eerie silence over our lives. The following morning, dozens of children were gone. One day they were there, the next they were taken, vanished into the white veil of nothingness, as if the fog had swallowed them whole, and no one seemed to remember them but me. I remember their names: Lily with her bright pink backpack, Tom who loved to play in the dirt, and little Sarah with her pigtails bouncing joyfully as she chased after butterflies. I tried to talk to the neighbors, but they just looked past me as if I was a ghost, their expressions flat and vacuous, and when I pushed for answers, they either changed the subject or looked away. I was losing more than just children, I was losing hope, and the memories faded like fading photographs, the colors running until only gray remained. I began to notice strange things in the fog, shadows darting at the edge of my vision as if something was lurking behind that opaque wall. I signed up for community meetings, searching for answers, praying someone would break the spell. We decided to form a search party, armed with flashlights and sheer desperation, but every corner we turned only seemed to deepen the mystery as the fog thickened and began to consume our resolve, leaving us disoriented. One night, I returned home after being unable to find anyone, my heart heavy and my mind weighed down by the incessant question, how many had I lost? I picked up my old family photo albums, scanning the pages, but the faces of my children felt like distant memories, the fog stealing even their images from me. And then, a knock came at the door, a sound too clear for the suffocating fog outside. It startled me, but I opened it to find a girl standing there, drenched in the mist, her hair stuck to her face, and her eyes wide. "Mommy?" She whimpered and I gasped, my heart launching up into my throat, because it was Lily, but she looked different, her skin was pale, and she trembled as if she had been pulled from some terrible place. Scrambling to embrace her, the warmth radiating from her was everything I had missed so desperately, but the deep shadows in her eyes told a different story. "Where are the others?" I asked frantically, looking behind her. She just shook her head, and it seemed she didn't want to remember, either. I led her inside, filled with hope but shadowed by this growing dread, and as I tended to her, trying to grasp how it was possible she had returned, the fog began to swirl outside like a living thing, whispering in demonic voices that made my skin crawl. A haunting echo of children's laughter reverberated against the walls, and in the whispers and shivers between the raindrops, I recognized the familiarity of my children's voices. "Can you hear them?" I had to ask, hoping she'd confront the haunting memories with me, that she'd tell me we could save them, but Lily just looked down, tears streaming silently as she curled into herself. "It's cold, Mommy," she replied, and just as I reached out to pull her closer, there was another knock at the door, this time more insistent. My heart ricocheted against my ribs, and instinctively, I knew it was another child. I opened the door and was met with Tom, drenched like Lily, hollow-eyed and silent, almost a shadow of himself, clutching a half-deflated soccer ball. "They want to play," he muttered, and my stomach dropped, thinking of whatever had taken them. "Who, Tom? Who wants to play?" I pressed, but he didn't respond, instead just staring out into the fog, and that's when I noticed it. The fog was shifting, swirling, almost pulsing like it was alive, absorbing these tortured children, and they were being drawn back into it, life pouring out of them like a spilled drink over the edge of the table. I desperately grabbed their hands and pulled them inside, but it felt like they were slipping through my fingers, souls tangled in the mist that threatened to devour us all. The laughter outside grew louder, a cacophony of sound that turned discordant and sinister, and suddenly it felt like the fog was no longer just a mist, it was a living entity, a monster that thrived on our fear, our despair, and as the shadows began to thicken around my door, crawling towards us, I knew it was only a matter of time before it came for me too. "Do you remember how many children you had before the fog?" I asked myself in despair as I clutched their hands tighter, feeling the coldness of the mist seeping in through the cracks, wrapping around me like a lover gone wrong, and I realized, with a sense of hollowness creeping in, I wasn't even sure how many I'd lost at this point, but I knew for every name I couldn't remember, the fog would demand its toll, and as the murmur of lost laughter echoed like a siren's song, I realized none of us might make it out alive. Has anyone else noticed the weird new trend where people in your peripheral vision play dead? I never thought I'd find myself saying that, but I swear there's something genuinely disturbing happening in my small town. It all started about a month ago when I was walking home late from work, exhausted after a long shift at the diner, when I first caught a glimpse of one. I was just about to cross the empty street when I noticed a figure lying sprawled on the sidewalk out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head, but when I did, there was nothing there, just an empty stretch of pavement. My heart raced, maybe I was just overtired, but the feeling gnawed at me. The next day, I encountered another one, an old man dressed in tattered clothes, collapsed against the faded brick wall. Again, a fleeting glance caught me off guard. I could have sworn his eyes were wide open, looking right at me, so I stopped and turned, only to find nothing but shadows where he should have been. With every sighting, I felt a chill in my bones, but I brushed it off as an overactive imagination. That was until I Googled it out of pure curiosity. Next thing I know, it was all over the forums. People across the globe started reporting the same phenomenon. They'd see someone in their peripheral vision, only to have them vanish as soon as they focused on them. Some even claimed they'd been touched or whispered to, One woman said she could feel a cold breath against her neck as she passed by a dead figure standing in her hallway. I laughed nervously at some stories, but deep down, I felt the fear creeping in. Nothing ever felt so easy to dismiss before. I should have known that something ominous was at work. My evenings grew restless. The innocent act of walking home transformed into a gauntlet of anxiety, feeling eyes on me, waiting to see who or what else would show up every time I looked away. A week passed, and I was haunted. It was just last Thursday when I nearly dropped my phone after seeing a little girl, pale and twisted, going limp in the grass of the park during my usual route. I hesitated, terrified, aware of the sudden silence around me, but when I dared to look, she faded like a mirage, leaving nothing but a gust of wind and an eerie chill hanging in the air. I tried to confide in my coworkers, but they just laughed it off, calling it some viral prank. Even my best friend told me I was being ridiculous, yet I felt this pang of isolation surge through me as more and more details of these play-dead occurrences came out. It became an obsession. I spent hours scanning the comments and posts online, desperate to understand what was happening, why this trend was popping up all over the world, if it was harmless or something worse, a morbid joke. Then I stumbled upon a video titled The Dead Game, and it changed everything. The uploader spoke calmly, detailing a story about a group who dared each other to ignore the dead in their view, claiming it only got worse. If you dared to engage, to look longer, to let your eyes linger, you'd somehow become a part of it. I didn't think much of it and went about my days, but as the night stretched on, that feeling of trepidation turned into paranoia, a deep anxiety that every waking moment was spiraling deeper into an unfathomable darkness. I grew tired of fighting it. I needed answers, so I set a plan in motion to confront what seemed to be lurking right in front of me. That Friday night, I joined a couple of friends for a night out, trying to force normalcy back into my life. I laughed and drank to ease the growing dread, half expecting my mind to play tricks again. By midnight, I could barely hold it together as the streetlights flickered ominously. Every time I turned my head, I swore I saw clusters of figures lying in wait, their bodies crumpled as if frozen in the act of playing dead. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my friends, the warm pitch of their laughter, but the moment I stepped outside, I glimpsed something chilling through the corner of my eye and froze. A woman, still as a statue in the alley, her face tilted toward the ground, her limbs bent at angles that shouldn't be humanly possible. The laughter of my friends faded as I stood there, unable to move, my pulse quickening. I could almost reach out and touch her if I dared. Panic gripped me, freezing every thought except one: to look harder, to look longer, and I did. My heart thundered painfully against my ribs as I leaned closer, my instincts screaming at me to turn away when I heard a whisper, a soft plea that felt like ice clawing at my bones. "Help me," it breathed, and just like that, the rest of the world vanished. I was trapped in this moment, standing in that alley with the woman who, if I believed everything I read, would draw me into her nightmare. My knees buckled, and I fell back, feeling the cold bite of the pavement where I landed. Everything fractured for an instant but my horror, wrestling with the choice to escape or embrace the torment. Then, without thinking, I blurted out, "What do you want?" The figure began to twitch, contorting unnaturally as if uncoiling from a deep slumber, and for the first time, I truly looked, seeing her gaunt cheeks and hollow eyes that spoke of twisted longing. The moment she raised her head, I felt a sick wave of recognition. I'd seen her before, the old man from the alley, the girl in the park, and all those ghostly figures who played dead. They were never just figments, they were trying to reach me, to pull me down into their silent abyss, and I was too late. As I scrambled to get up, her face morphed into a grotesque smile, her voice dripping with a malevolent lullaby. "Join us. Now you are one of us." In that instant, my head filled with the whispers of all those who had come before me, their voices echoing their silent screams, and in that moment, I knew, I was not going to escape the consequences of looking. I began to tremble, sparks igniting around me as the world turned dark, and the last thing I remember was the cold ground giving way beneath my feet, surrendering me to the play-dead game, a part of the escalating horror. Trapped in the lifeless eyes of those who had come before, I could feel the breath fading from my lungs as they corralled around me, forever pulling me deeper into the void. So, has anyone else noticed the weird new trend where people in your peripheral vision play dead? Because trust me, if you have, don't look, don't even blink. Just keep walking.